conference, slightly different from the norm. The last few years we've been in the Stirling Court Hotel, congregating as a group of independent prison monitors, but wherever you are, either in your front room or perhaps some of our colleagues from the Scottish Prison Service are in the local establishments at the moment, you're welcome. Our conference this morning is on the theme of progression, and these certainly aren't the circumstances we'd like to be talking about progression. And for those of you who are active or maybe inactive independent prison monitors at the moment, it's been a bumpy year to say the least, like it has been for everyone. Obviously, when coronavirus took hold in March, we suspended our on-site visits into each SPS establishment, and we went to a remote monitoring framework, and we're very, very grateful to all of you independent prison monitors who helped us out in that regard. And recently we've gradually moved back to on-site monitoring in each of the 15 establishments, and that will continue through winter and into the new year, hopefully. Although everything is, I suppose, a little bit up in the air as we wait for all the new guidance coming out. Just by way of introduction, for those of you that don't know me, I think most of you will, I'm Chris Collins, I'm the Prison Monitoring Coordinator for West and South Scotland. And so long as our IT allows, I will try and host today. I'm grateful to Kerry Love at HMIPS for helping us out with some technical issues. Hopefully everything will go okay today and we can have as good a conference as possible. But if there are some technical issues, we'll work through them. But at the moment, we seem to be okay, and we have some excellent speakers lined up to take us through the morning and the early afternoon. We're scheduled to run from 10 o'clock to 2 today. We've factored in some breaks so that you're not all staring at the screen for too long. As I say, it's been a strange year for prison monitoring. It's been a strange year for all big institutions and everyone in general. So we were conscious that we wanted to do something like we normally do every autumn, just to see where we are in terms of our monitoring practice, see where we want to go next. And I know that our Chief Inspector, Wendy, will make reference to a lot of that in our first keynote in a few moments. When we were thinking about what we wanted to do in terms of a theme for this year's conference, we quite naturally ended up at progression as the theme that we wanted to look at. It's something that I know as independent prison monitors will have been an issue for you as you've made your way around each establishment, speaking to prisoners, going to meetings with governors, deputy governors, and speaking to staff at all levels. And one thing that is fairly obvious is that it's a matter of great complexity, and I'm really grateful to have Eddie Cottress from SPS, who's the head of risk there, along to speak to us later on today. Even in the brief chat that I had with Eddie during the week as we prepped for today, the complexities involved in sentence progression is really quite illuminating for us. So I'm really hopeful that by the end of today we'll have a greater clarity, a better understanding of what that means both for prisoners and also for the institutions and organisations who are tasked with progressing sentences. And everyone has a vested interest in sentences being progressed and risk being appropriately managed, and it's of interest to the wider community and justice in Scotland in general. So hopefully, as you reflect back on your own experiences of dealing with matters related to progression, and it's such a wide term, and I'm sure we'll be able to break that down as we go through the day, we'll be able to think about how we apply that into our monitoring practice as we move on. I'll introduce the speakers as we go. We've got two representatives from SPARC who are going to speak to us after the Chief Inspector, and I'm sure they will give us a very interesting view on sentence progression through the prism of people in custody who are wanting to get to those various points where you can go to open estate, you can go on home leave, all of the different things that come into the idea of progression through your sentence. So thanks for joining us this morning. I hope you can stay with us for the duration. I'll hand over now to the Chief Inspector, who will give us an overview and then again introduce the theme of progression and where, as an inspection body, we see progression in terms of our priorities as an office over the coming 12 months. So, Wendy.
Chris, thank you. Well, first of all, let me just say good morning, everyone. How lovely to speak to you. And it's very, very strange in Zoom. I so much prefer just standing in front of a stage, seeing faces, seeing an interaction, getting that buzz from the audience. But it's not to be. So I'll sit here with my mad hair in my room, and I feel extraordinarily privileged. I've managed to have a room dedicated to my office in my home I look out over trees, I've got an income, and I think in these challenging times, I am extraordinarily privileged. However, what I'm not going to talk to you today is not about just progression, although that does feature later on, but just a few reminders and a few thank yous and a few contextual understanding of where we've been or where we're going. A couple of things to remember. So first of all, Article 10, the United Nations International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. All persons deprived of their liberty should be treated with humanity and with respect for the inherent dignity of the human person. So important. We also, or rather HMIPS under the UK, contributes to the optional protocol to the UN Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhuman or degrading treatment or punishment, short version, OPCAT, which requires that all places of detention are visited regularly by independent bodies. Now, we have that power and authority in legislation, and so in reality, we're right there. And one of the most important things we do is that the IPMs go in every week. There's nowhere people can hide if every week there's somebody coming in and checking that everything's okay. And I can't say thank you enough. One of the interesting things is during COVID, I was really, really worried that everybody would just disappear. That all our IPMs who've done such sterling work in the past would say, it's too dangerous, I'm not doing it, I've got my own health to consider, I just can't do this, I can't even phone in, life's too busy. And I really thought we would lose nearly all of our IPMs. It was one of the key things on my risk register. Instead of which, we've still got around 98 IPMs. Many of the prisons struggle with just one or two. Glenorchy, I know, struggles. But nonetheless, we've still got heavy duty commitment, professionalism, and all of the attributes of wonderful, wonderful people going into the prison. We are starting another recruitment campaign. Off we go. We'll try it. We've got one underway, but we will start another one to try and build the numbers. But nonetheless, looking at the numbers, it's really reassuring. When we do our annual report, one of the things we do is we look at what we've done in the last year. So if you look at from the 1st of April 2019 to 31st of March 2020, just at the beginning of the roller coaster, we've got some outstanding results. And so I've actually written a presentation around this, and we will send the presentation out after the conference. So IPMs volunteered 4,500 hours of their time. That's not an insignificant amount. You dealt with over 1,000 requests. That's unbelievable. And prisons were visited on 948 different occasions. You should be proud. And my presentation has frozen, typical. Oh, excuse me for a minute while I just try and work out what's happening here, because something's not working. Okay, here we go. Right, much better, thank you. So, when we talked about my last presentation, we talked about one of the things I wanted to do as the strategic priorities for 1920 was to work out a risk management framework. We know we have weekly IPM visits. We knew we did 4 full inspections of a prison each year. We knew we did 4 court custody unit inspections and prisoner transport inspections a year. But we didn't have, when I first joined, a kind of integration of inspections, monitoring, sites that we visited, all of the intelligence behind it. And I think we have developed that integrated approach. We've retained our independence, but IPMs advise the inspection team. Your advice is invaluable. Priam is mined for the intelligence to focus the inspection of what we're actually going to focus and do a deep dive on in the inspection. And post the inspection, we've started working out action plans for monitors to check on things that we were nervous about or were best practice and we wanted to be able to laud them, which would be really good. So all of that leading up to the elephant in the room, which is inevitably COVID. So the COVID roller coaster, although I think we had some advance warning, really kicked off in March with the national lockdown. In April, the Prisons and Young Offenders Institution Bill came out, which was enacted in May, and the Coronavirus Act was enacted in May. It was given a sunshine clause to finish in September, but it's now been extended to the 31st of March. What those two, the statutory instruments and the Act, did was it gave sweeping powers to the SPS and judiciary. And some of the less obvious ones that are fought against were not having to provide specialist diets, not having to provide clean clothes. I am delighted that the SPS absolutely never used those, but also more importantly perhaps, said we don't need it when the Coronavirus Act was extended. We don't need those, we'll manage. So what did happen? Well, you had the executive emergency release in May and June of 348 prisoners. We had reduced court activity. And by June, the population was reduced by more or less 1,000, from over 8,200 to 7,000. The other thing that happened was all the reforms that we've been campaigning for years suddenly accelerated. And you had definite accelerated reform to find alternatives to family contact. Superb. So what happened in HMIPS on that same roller coaster ride? In March, we suspended the on-site inspections and monitoring. We wrote a letter of concern to the Cabinet Secretary, deep concern, that unless the prison population was reduced, we had real concern that such a compressed population in such close proximity was at major risk of the virus sweeping through and causing devastation. I'm really glad that didn't happen. In April, we developed a remote monitoring framework, a risk algorithm for a shorter adapted methodology of scrutiny for prison inspections, a liaison visits framework for prisons, court custody units and prisoner transport. We sought volunteer IPMs to do remote calls with management and prisoners. We met with the Cabinet Secretary, with the Scottish Human Rights Commission and the chair and the deputy chair of the advisory group for IPMs, and we started our newsletter and Zoom calls. In May, we published and implemented our remote monitoring framework and liaison visit framework and set off. In June, we lost one of our PMCs, Kerry Brooks, to Scottish Government COVID team, and Kerry will be away from us until June the next year, a whole year away. We miss her terribly, but we have coped. In July, we surveyed the appetite for IPMs to return to on-site visits with a full understanding it is absolutely a matter of personal choice. And we also had Healthcare Improvement Scotland join us. Now, why did they join us on the scrutiny visits? Was because we had a pilot in HMP Edinburgh, and it was very clear that health was one of the primary issues, health and infection control. And therefore, if we were going to do any deep dive scrutiny, we really needed help with us. In August, we developed and implemented a blended model of remote monitoring. And to that, I have to thank those very brave IPMs who've agreed to go back to on-site visiting, and extended our liaison visit process to 2 days rather than 1 day. In December, we're taking the next step forward. We've got the Care Inspectorate and Education Scotland joining us in the liaison visits, which are the shortened inspections. So our COVID roller coaster kind of took off and had a heap and then settled into kind of comfortable how we managed, less comfortable looking at the very frightening statistics around COVID. But we hit the next dip. The emergency powers did a lot of things, but there are major challenges arising from it. The number of prisoners who were returned to custody on historical warrants, having achieved early release, was very, very high. The impact of a resumption of, or the delays in court activity, were huge backlogs. 750 High Court cases, approximately 1,800 Sheriff Court solemn cases, 57,000 summary cases. Now, backlogs occur in court activity all the time, but 57,000 summary cases is about twice what it normally is. Huge backlog of unpaid work with the inability to deliver that from the local authorities, 750,000 hours of unpaid work. There is a reality of a kind of media issue on that, in the sense that, does there any credibility of unpaid work if it has such a huge backlog? And then inevitably, the prison population started to rise with remand prisoners. Bear in mind, one of the emergency powers was an extension to the remand period. So with the court activity not being so busy, remands inevitably went up. Sadly, the prison population is also going up. And with the backlog, it may well exceed where we were before. And certainly the modelling is quite scary. So the Cabinet Secretary for Justice is very, very clear that we had to achieve a different model to maintain a sustainable reduction in the prison population. And he put together, or rather there is together, a justice board with the heading of Recover, Renew and Transform, a criminal justice response to COVID. And you have all the major organisations, Scottish Government, Police Scotland, COPS, Courts, Criminal Justice Scotland, the SPS, Legal Aid, all working in partnership, looking at short, medium and bold long-term solutions to the challenges. And some of the solutions that they're looking at was an increased use of technology and digital platforms, virtual courts, alternatives to custody, supported bail, resolution of outstanding warrants, so people in prison who have outstanding warrants, they're dealt with while they're in prison, if possible. A look at why so many people are breaching bail and are recalls from lifers, electronic monitorings directly from court, a drive on getting home detention curfew back to its previous numbers, and reducing the backlogs in jury trials while still managing social distancing. Innovatively, they're using cinemas to put the jury into the cinema and the court carries on and everything's connected by video link. I think it's quite an exciting use of a cinema, but as a deep film fanatic, I feel very sorry that I can't go to the cinema. It's also eye-wateringly expensive, but at least it means the trials are beginning and almost back up to their usual standard or their pre-COVID ability to cope with numbers, which means that victims aren't waking forever. So here we go. So what's happened? So there we are. The HMIPS has gone through huge change. Everything's going through huge change. It's rapid change. Have we got credible impact from what we're doing? I think we have. So, what's happening here? Sorry, my computer is really playing up. I think we have a high caliber IPM cohort delivering high caliber monitoring with a level of intelligence that is just incredible and really informs the future of which HMIPS should focus. Can't say thank you enough. More importantly, we are managing that weekly monitoring. We've got 1 or 2 weeks which haven't managed, but on the whole, despite COVID, despite everything else that's going on, we have achieved that. Well done. The remote monitoring framework, I think we were the first organisation, scrutiny body, to achieve that. And the number of phone calls we received from people saying, could you send us a copy? Absolutely. And it was certainly replicated at speed around the estate. We've still got new volunteers willing to join us, and Scottish society is beginning to be more broadly represented. Thank you to all of you who've joined. The evidence of what you do is right there. You know, there's the simple stuff like time in fresh air, but the biggies, you know, funding for the refurbishment of the the holding cells in Barlinnie, the replacement for Barlinnie, time in fresh air. So important. You provide hard, independent evidence that we can justifiably speak to government, parliament, the SPS, the courts and say, this isn't working, this needs addressed. What are you going to do about it? Well, the other thing that happened in our roller coaster is that we rapidly increased the number of inspections we do. So since March, we've done 17 court custody units and 11 prisons. There have been distinct noted improvements, but we would not have been able to do such a rapid inspection in a prison if we hadn't had the knowledge and information from IPMs to inform us. Let's just look at something that the Independent Prison Monitoring Board Advisory Group have done as well. So all the information we received, the chair and the deputy chair met with the health boards and managed to get them to agree to deliver testing for all prisoners. Superb. Some of the findings have been very, very negative. Time in cell. So many prisoners are still locked up too many hours a day. And in reality, social isolation experienced by many prisoners before COVID has just been enhanced and increased. Jill Long's article on remand prisoners in the Herald last week, absolutely superb and so apt and pertinent. Purposeful and rehabilitative activities, offending behaviour groups, education, workshops, and remember that just turning up and going to work and going back to work in the evening is a work ethic that is just such an important part of rehabilitation. All of those have been absolutely devastated, and the number of people able to access work for any reasonable length in any reasonable day is very small indeed. During emergency release, everybody who was liberated had accommodation found for them. Sadly, since that period, homeless liberations continue, despite the Shore standards, despite strenuous efforts to engage with the local housing authorities and for the SPS to do everything they can to make sure people aren't released homeless, but some are. Progression, probably the biggest complaint. When we look at the SPS complaints, their biggest complaint is property. Our biggest complaint, the one that we get the most of the letters through and the most of the phone calls, is progression. It wasn't in great condition before. There were already large waiting lists for key offending behaviour programmes, and the dependency on offending behaviour programmes to manage progression meant that that has all been somewhat stalled. And I'll come on to the good bits out of that later, but nonetheless, progression is a major concern now for Inspectorate. And so next year, it's the focus of our thematic review, next thematic review. Remand numbers are disproportionately high. 27 to 30% of the population are now on remand. If you think that normally other places like Australia and England operate around 10%, to have such high numbers is worrying. What is even more worrying is that 78% of those under 18 are on remand. And bear in mind, you can now be held on remand for 6 months longer than you could before under the emergency powers. The population, despite all the efforts, has returned to 7,500, with 9 prisons overcrowded in unacceptable conditions, i.e. cells designed for 1 but holding 2. It's extraordinarily difficult to manage any form of rehabilitation activity if the number of spaces is exceeded by the number of prisoners. There's nothing the prison service can do about that other than try their best. They are not responsible for the number of people entering their prison. In our opinion, if people don't have access to communal phones, phones within their room to manage the phone calls to their family, showers, and time in the fresh air of an hour daily, then in our opinion, human rights are breached. But there's some positives. We were seriously impressed by the speed and response of the SPS to the COVID crisis. The implementation of really good infection control to make sure that people were retained safely, just so impressive. Prisoners and staff are all largely appreciative of the efforts to keep them safe. There are a few dissenting voices, but the vast majority are very appreciative of both the efforts to keep them safe and, importantly, the level of communication that has gone on. The feeling of fear that we first encountered on our first visit has diminished. The other thing that's seriously impressive is that prisoners have cooperated with that. It could so easily have led to an adverse response, but it didn't. And I just think a lot of that is down to the relationships between the staff and the prisoners, and importantly, the level of communication. Those two things, relationships and communication, are really impressive. There's been noted improvements from the first days. The first kind of instinctive reaction, lock everybody up who's in any way symptomatic and don't let them out of their room, that when we raised that as a breach of human rights was responded to incredibly fast. And we're really impressed with that. The justice response, and effective in reducing the population initially through the emergency release, the court activity, increased home detention curfew, that combined justice response, really good. I like the alternative approaches that have been developed and implemented. In-cell telephony, virtual visits, the use of Buvidal, COVID testing and tracing, and then, thankfully, the return of face-to-face visits, but still having virtual visits and in-cell telephony. I know that the take-up is low, and I'm grateful to IPMs to reporting on that, but I hope that as life moves on, we can retain the in-cell telephones and virtual visits, and that they will gradually have greater and greater take-up. Families outside did a survey, and many families are saying that they don't want to travel in public transport. They don't want to risk bringing infection into the prison, and therefore they're very grateful for the virtual visits. Infection control measures. Guidance was issued by the Health Protection Scotland and local health providers. Importantly, despite our fears at the very early stages that it would sweep through with devastating effect, COVID deaths remain low at 5. Compare that to the care homes. Essential healthcare services continued to operate across the estate. Additional staff were available due to the core day, and although prisoners are locked up at times, staff feel that they are able to do so much more. And under progression, the one positive piece of news is that the RMTs and the ICMs either adapted or continued as was. Impressive. So where to next? I like to do a 3-year thinking through. And for 2021, I'm very clear. We need to review the response to the CPT reports, the 2018 and the 2019 CPT report that was published in October this year. It is our job to look at the areas that the CPT have reported on with concern and to develop a response and a report. I think it's really important that we continue with monitoring, remote or otherwise, despite COVID. And we continue to report and continue to campaign on key issues or concerns, as well as reporting on best practice. One of the things I'm keen to do, and your PMCs will be in touch, is ensure that all regions are represented on the IPM advisory group. At the moment, we don't have all regions represented, and I want to make sure that happens. We need to publish our thematic reviews. So Who Cares will come out this month, or Who Cares Now, about elderly people. And are you all aware there's a 46% increase since our original report of people over the age of 60 in prison? That's an incredible amount. And then the Deaths in Custody review, which is going ahead, will publish next year. One of my key agenda items is to get the digital platforms improved. to allow you to access Priam or report in some other method from home. That hit just total suspension during COVID, but is now being picked up again by Graham Neal, thankfully. 2021-22, I'm hoping to be able to do a review of the HMIPS response to COVID. I'm hoping by the end of 2021, we may be able to do that because COVID will be under control. But more importantly, I want that response to be identified of what has been good in this, what has been really effective, what can we retain in the future in our new monitoring and inspection model. For instance, the liaison visits have been much more frequent, and especially in the court custody units. Instead of doing 4 a year with 49 courts, it would be every 10 years, we did 17, and we noted distinct improvements between each one. It was quite incredible. We'd go into one, we'd say there isn't any social distancing paperwork up here, there's no displays, posters, guidelines, sticky tape on the floor. By the time we got to the next one, 2 weeks later, it was all in place. Incredible. I want to make sure that in the first half of 2021, after April, our progression thematic review and our prisoner transport thematic reviews are well underway, and I'll certainly be looking for volunteers. One of the things I want to do is adapt the University of Cambridge monitoring of the quality of prison life survey for us to be able to use it in Scottish prisons. What that will mean is we can benchmark Scottish prisons with accurate and valid data. More importantly, we can then benchmark Scottish prisons with other jurisdictions around the world, like Australia or England and Wales. I want to have a much larger number of IPMs for prison who develop their own identity for that prison, and more importantly, start to think about what they see as the IPM strategic priorities, so that when we produce our next strategic plan, the IPM strategic priorities are decided by the IPMs and the PMCs with Stephen. I want to do a serious review of progress against IPM projects. We all know about the Linda Pollock, but there are many other projects going ahead. And Stephen, I know, can talk about exactly how many of the Linda Pollock 100 and God knows how many recommendations have actually been implemented. It was a superb study, it really was, but it's not broad enough, and we need to make sure all of you are involved in driving it forward in ways that you think are appropriate. I want to make sure that our regional development recommences next year. I know we may not be able to do it face to face, but we can, if this is successful, take this pattern and move it on to the quarterly regional development programs. And then in 2022-23, you will tell me what the IPM strategic priorities are, but I want to do a thematic review on health. And I want to make sure by 23, we are recognised as world leaders in monitoring and inspection. I mean, that was always our vision, to be a global leader in independent prison monitoring. And I'd like to add in brackets, even under COVID. However, before I go, I just want to remind you of a few things. We've done clapping for the NHS. We praise the emergency services. We give thanks to the people who make life work: bin men, shop assistants, delivery people, prison officers. I want to leave you with 3 things that I hope you remember out of this. While we all face severe restrictions to our movement and freedom to tackle the growing crisis that is this pandemic, the reality is that Scotland's prisons face the extra layer of risk. Those who live and work and visit prisons are a particularly vulnerable population, where in largely overcrowded conditions, they have a limited ability to take their own precautions. However, the COVID-19 outbreak must never be used as a justification for undermining adherence to the safeguards incorporated in the standard minimum rules for the treatment from the United Nations, aka the Nelson Mandela rules. And finally, I have made it clear that protective measures, regardless of the COVID crisis, must never result in human or degrading treatment of prisoners, people deprived of their liberty. And for that reason, our scrutiny will continue. And it's your work as IPMs that actually ensures week on week the treatment and conditions for prisoners are as good as they can be. So I just want to say a huge thank you for continuing on this task in extraordinarily challenging times. And I wish I could get the whole country to clap for you, our hidden heroes, doing an amazing job. You deserve it, and I can't give it to you, but thank you. It's me finished.
Thanks very much, Wendy. I'm sure you'll all agree that was a really good overview and an excellent start to our seminar today. Wendy, we do have a few questions that have came in just as you were going through your presentation there. So if you don't mind, I'll maybe pose them to you just now. I'll take them together and then you can perhaps decide how you want to respond to the group that's on the webinar, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Jacqueline Fordyce is asked about the level of information that we receive at HMIPS from the Scottish Prison Service, and in particular, if it's adequate to allow proper monitoring and inspection with regard to the data that we receive, particularly on COVID. So that was the first one. Elizabeth Gray is asked a question just regarding general credence and credibility that's given to our findings as independent prison monitors by governors and establishments, and how we could perhaps increase that and also disseminate our findings throughout the prison. And the last question, Wendy, was from Paul Edlin, which is specific to Barlinnie and in particular the coronavirus outbreak there. Paul is asked if we at the Inspectorate have a view on the management response there and the isolation practices. And also there's a query around access to phone calls with prisoners at Barlinnie. Now I know Ewan McKenzie, who's the prison monitoring coordinator for Barlinnie, isn't on the webinar. I think he's going to join us this afternoon. So in the second half of that question, Paul, I think there would probably be a response there from Ewan, but I'll leave the first part about the management response at Barlinnie in light of the outbreak of COVID cases to you, Wendy. So that is really about information relating to COVID from SPSHQ. The second one about our position and our findings and how they're disseminated throughout the prison. And the third one was specific to the outbreak at Barlinnie.
Okay, thank you. Firstly, the information we get from the SPS is absolutely astonishing. They have been open and transparent with all the information they collect. When I have suggested to them that there is additional information we need, they promptly started to gather it for us rather than gathering it for themselves. So for instance, we get a daily population report, we get a weekly breakdown of the population and more importantly, where the trends are happening. We get a daily COVID update of how many prisoners are symptomatic, how many are positive, how many have been tested, how many people are isolating because they've been with someone or been in contact, how many people are coming in from abroad and have to go into quarantine, how many people are received in reception that day, how many people are out in HDC. We also get a monthly information analysis, which breaks down all the incidents, all the population, all the trends, all the analysis. We asked for a snapshot on regime and activities across the different cohorts. So tell us what Rule 41s get, tell us what Rule 40As get, tell us what everybody in the SRU gets, what people on non-offence protection, people on offence protection, your ordinary decent criminal, what do they get? They do those snapshots whenever we ask, and they're very happy to do that. The amount of information we get is absolutely astonishing. It is superb. I can't argue. They are open and transparent, and anything we ask for, we're given. I think the level of cooperation from the Scottish Prison Service has truly been astonishing, and I just have to thank them for it. Equally, I can phone the Chief Exec whenever I have concerns, and any member of the senior management team. Regularly, Stephen meets with the single point of contact in the prison service to sort out any operational glitches. It really is a really impressive level of cooperation and support. Credence and credibility, always an interesting one. As an ex-prison governor, if I thought what the inspectorate was saying was absolutely bonkers, I didn't give it any credibility. I'll be completely honest. And I should imagine that there will be some governors out there who think, what? What are they saying? Are they nuts? But every single governor has confirmed to me personally, and to many of the IPMs and to many of my team, that actually they welcome the inspections and they welcome the IPMs, and it keeps them on their toes. And a certain prison governor, who will remain nameless, possibly gave the best example of that, which I thought was wonderful. And he said, it's like your mother-in-law visiting, and you suddenly look around the house and you notice the grubby corners, and you notice the tear in the carpet, and you think, oh, blimey, she's about to visit, better sort this out. So he said, inspections are like your mother-in-law visiting. But in reality, the IPM's visiting is like your next door neighbour visiting, where you want it to be good. You want them to be looking at you and saying you're doing a good job. You want that. You don't want to disappoint them. And so I think we do have credence and credibility. And more importantly, I am extraordinarily lucky that I have the ability to escalate to the Cabinet Secretary whenever I want. I have his mobile number. If I have concerns, I can escalate. And I have escalated a number of things. So at the beginning of the COVID crisis, I escalated my concerns. Fairly quickly we met with him and I said, we can't have this breach of human rights. People have to be allowed out of cell. People have to be able to phone their family. People have to be able to phone their legal advisors. And to my delight, he listens carefully, but so do the SPS. And usually by the time I've spoken to the Cabinet Secretary, the SPS have sorted it, which is good. However, they are stuck with what they have to deal with. So the SPS has a number of prisons, we all know them, that are frankly unfit for purpose. If you look at Barlinnie, they had a massive outbreak there. The governor campaigned to get mass testing in very successfully. 600 people got tested. They could not, Public Health Scotland said you have to have very small groups to allow them out for time in the fresh air. They could not manage all 300 people who were isolating to give them an hour in the fresh air, an hour on the wings to phone from the communal phone helplines or us. They could not, and have a shower, they could not manage that. They had to reduce it to 30 minutes. The logistics were impossible. I don't blame the SPS for that. I think we need, as a country, to stop using prison so much and reduce the numbers so that you can manage. Prisons have to be a place where people can be managed safely. And frankly, we've got far too many cells in the Scottish estate that were designed for one. Because of the overcrowding, the SPS have been obliged to put in 2 bunks, and you've got 2 people sharing a space that, according to the United Nations, is not fit for purpose. I'm not going to back down from that. That happens. But I do worry that with these numbers in prison, it is impossible for the SPS to have managed anything else. Didn't stop me though. I recognise the problems they're under. I recognise the decisions they had to take. I reckon that they were justified and possibly proportionate, but they aren't reasonable. And as a result, I wrote a formal letter of complaint quoting the human rights legislation and where it was being breached around Barlinnie. And I do that fairly regularly and people do listen. It's quite incredible, the number of phone calls and flurry that occurs after that while they frantically look at what else they can do. However, when you've got Public Health Scotland saying you cannot let all these people out together, they have very little choices. Access to phones is interesting. So for the first, it takes 7 days for the mobile phone to be set up for the prisoner. It is really important they have access to the communal phone. It is also really important that they have access to the communal phone for the free helplines, apart from the Samaritans, who are on their mobile phone, and for our number. And that is a difficult question, and it's something we are harassing the Scottish Prison Service about, to get the mobile phones for prisoners able to be used in every area of the prison, able to be topped up from their private income, able to be used 24 hours a day, have our number, free phone number on it, and other free phone numbers. They do know that we want to do this, and they will try. I hope that answers it. Stephen, have you got anything to add to that?
Nothing on that. No, I saw there was a question about mental health and that, and you know, are we worried about the mental health of prisoners? And the answer is yes for that, very much so. That the isolation is an issue. The fact that they have been unfortunately locked up for a lot longer than normal is definitely a concern.
And part of that is I sit on the National Preventative Network, which is 21 scrutiny bodies that meet together nationally. And we've decided our thematic review for the National Preventative Network, which includes Chief Inspector of Constabulary, Chief Inspector of Prosecutions, Health. We will be doing a thematic review on mental health. Got to. It is a real area of concern, and it's an area of concern in the community. You know, you have to think of people isolated in their own home under Tier 4. I don't know that the mental health services have the capacity to cope with what I think is coming round the corner.
Thanks, Wendy. We've received a few supplementary questions just as you were answering those. I don't know that we'll get to those, but just to give a flavour of what's been coming in, and at the Inspectorate we'll certainly get back to all the questions that come in through the Q&A in one forum or another today.
Is it worth mentioning also we will be sending out the presentation that I've done to everybody? Yeah.
So there's a question about actual COVID details, I think from Lindsay down in HMP Dumfries there, about whether we get COVID details about individual prison officers and individual establishments. Hugh McGloin raised a question around statistics related to homelessness, which I see Dan Gunn has responded to. So I think all of those things do tie into the overall picture about progression, and no doubt our speakers later on today will talk about what prisoners and those in custody are actually being released into, and what provision they have when they're coming out of each establishment. So those are a flavour of some of the questions that have come in. I know, Stephen, you've sort of responded to the question about the mental health status of prisoners, but what I would say is that that's something that we certainly will focus on in the new year. I think it's obvious to anyone, if time behind cell doors has been so dramatically increased over the past few months, that there's going to be an impact on people's mental health. And in a couple of prisons in Marriage, and I know we've already looked at an overview of what provision is available, and that would be the starting point. But obviously we get the Talk to Me figures from individual establishments, and we'd be keen to continue that dialogue with both those in custody and deputy governors and governors to see what's been done to accommodate some of these issues that have been exacerbated by the lockdown. So thanks to everyone who submitted a question there during Wendy's presentation. We're on track, and I'm delighted we've been joined by our next speakers, Cara Jardine and Scott McMillan from Spark. I'll introduce them in just a few minutes. Shall we take a couple of minutes comfort break? And then we'll reconvene at 11 o'clock. I'll introduce our next speakers and we'll continue on from there.
Chris, if you just want to just quickly mention that we do get all the stats on staff who are ill, including the test and protect, so that we know where the locus of their infection has come from. We do get that.
Thanks, Wendy. I think there is an issue about how we then share that with IPM teams in terms of assessing risk for going into prisons, but no doubt that's a conversation that we'll come on to as the webinar progresses. So maybe 5 minutes and we shall reconvene with the next speakers.
Heading out? Yeah. Are you going to see Jean? Yeah. Right, her jumper here. Okay. Let's throw it downstairs. I'll back off track. Just give my sleeve. Can you think about getting a piece of cake for Brian? What was that, Wendy? You're going to yourself, think about getting a piece of cake for Brian.
Can I ask people to put themselves on mute, please? There's quite a lot of background noise.
We opened today, but I don't think it's regarded as essential.
Wendy, can you put yourself on mute, please? Wendy,
What's that, sorry?
can you put yourself on mute, please?
Yes, sorry.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Can everyone hear me? We'll move on to the next part of our webinar today. Delighted that we've been joined by our colleagues from the Scottish Prisoner Advocacy and Research Collective. I shall do their introductions in just a second. As I mentioned at the start, we at the Inspectorate and yourselves as independent prison monitors are frequently tasked with assisting those in custody with their progression, and sometimes these matters can be quite complex. And I know from previous experience, when I speak to people in various different establishments, you can sense the hope and sometimes desperation and sometimes frustration when they present to you matters related to their sentence progression. And sometimes it's quite bewildering, especially to me, if you don't have all those correct answers to give them, or you can't progress their questions sufficiently. And that's not necessarily our job to unpick all of that. Often that is left to the individuals themselves and to the Scottish Prison Service and a number of other agencies. But I think as independent prison monitors, we do have a duty to try and understand that as best we can. And to that end, we've invited along today Scott McMillan and Cara Jardine. As I said, they are part of SPARK, which is a collective researching experiences of imprisonment. I shall just call up some of the bios here. So Scott is a postgraduate researcher at the University of Dundee and is working with SCCJR to develop PhD research into progression. Scott is also a co-founder of SPARK and has led on a number of projects, including on the impact of COVID on people, families and communities impacted by prisons. Cara will also be delivering the last presentation of today and will co-deliver with Scott just now, I think. Cara is a senior lecturer in the School of Social Work and Social Policy at University of Strathclyde. She's researching people's experiences of community from within prison, the permeability of the prison wall and the resulting implications for citizenship, legitimacy and reintegration. There's a lot more I could add to that. Cara also has a book out at the moment, so congratulations on that, Cara. And I will pass over to both of you now for your Snakes and Ladders presentation.
Thanks very much, Chris. We're really excited to be here. So we're going to be a little bit of a double act today. We're going to be talking about some of the work we've been doing on progression, which is something we've been interested in for quite a long time. So we're going to be passing backwards and forwards, but Scott's going to start us off.
Hi, so I'm Scott McMillan and I'm just going to give you a wee bit of information about SPARK and who we are and what we do. So SPARK is a group of people with a shared agenda, social justice and inclusivity. So our collective comes from various universities and criminal justice organisations, and we're all at various stages of study and career. We all have some experience of working within the criminal justice system, while some of us also have personal experience of imprisonment. For these many perspectives, we work together as equals and we aim for collective action, and that really is the aspiration, is to be non-hierarchical. We struggle with that sometimes, but the idea is to be in a situation where those with lived experience are talking about those who do or for those who do as subjects, and conversely the other side of that is that those with lived experience aren't trying to have the last word unchallenged on anything prison related. We feel there's a good balance between working together in that dynamic and challenging each other on those bases. Our aim is really just trying to extend that ethic and trying to amplify rather than interpret the voices of those most affected by the justice system. We directly access the community through some of our links, and we're just typically trying to take a community that's talked about often rather than talked to or listened to, and really trying to represent that as sort of honestly and directly as we possibly can. We ultimately aim to expose injustices within the prison system. In this case, it's the unintended consequences of progression, which I hope our presentation today will leave you on no doubt of if you didn't already feel that way. And ideally pushing for change as we do. We push for change because we believe that imprisonment is inherently harmful and inflicts damage on all who pass through it. Imprisonment is the most severe punishment that we as a free society can inflict. It's perhaps this pandemic can help us all to keep that in mind now more than ever. And then recognising that severity, it's incumbent on anybody who's involved in criminal justice to challenge practices and systems that prolong and entrench imprisonment for any longer than is absolutely necessary. Hand over to Cara now.
So, as Scott said, we're really looking to sort of broaden out the conversations that happen around criminal justice and prisons. You know, very often in Scotland, it's quite a small group of people that get to talk to these issues. So that's our real aim, is to widen out this conversation and include more voices in it. So with that in mind, I want to start talking about progression with two stories. So I'm going to introduce you to Adam. And Adam received a life sentence in 2005 with a 12-year tariff. And Adam, although this is a really long and difficult sentence, you know, he adapts quite well, engages really well with programs. He moves smoothly through each stage of his sentence. He's able to maintain really good links with his family, able to take advantage of all the sort of new initiatives and innovative things that are going on across the estate to do with family contact. Whilst he's in custody, he finds a new enthusiasm for education. Although he's someone that never thought maybe that university would be accessible to him, he manages to complete his undergraduate degree through distance learning. Moves through each stage of his sentence, gets a place at National Top End, does 2 years in the open estate, has his parole hearing and is granted parole. And Adam is maybe what we think about when we think about progression, because there's something really interesting even about calling the criminal justice system a system, right? It sort of implies that it is systematic and logical and ordered and the same for everyone, and that it was designed to all work smoothly together. Whereas everybody here knows, right, the criminal justice system is much more complicated than that. So while we might have the ideal in our head of you move smoothly through your sentence, you get increasingly more freedom, more community access, and then you're successfully granted parole in or around the time of the end of your tariff. We also know that things are much more complicated than that. So we also want you to meet Bob. So Bob enters prison with a drug dependency and continues to use drugs throughout his time in prison. Despite that, he does work his way to the top end. He's granted some community access. And that's a really big event in Bob's life because he's able to re-establish some contact with his family that he hasn't had for years. Although he's been able to kind of keep his drug use on the down low, he's been able to conceal it, he does eventually fail the drug test. So because he's in top end, he's placed on disciplinary. This means he's downgraded back to closed. He then has to have an additional program requirement to address his addictions. That program requirement has a waiting list of 6 months. It doesn't run in the prison that he's in. He needs to get a place in that prison. He's then transferred to complete the course, which he does, but he then has to wait for his paperwork to follow him around the estate, for his social worker to complete the reports that he needs, and for him then to go back on the waiting list for top end, which he does get to, you know, he is progressing through the system. But it means that 21 months after he initially fails the drug test, Bob returns to top end. So he's got a significant delay to his sentence, but we also really want to recognize that this is really difficult for people who have to live through this. So in the time that he's been living with this uncertainty of where am I going, what am I doing, will I get placed, am I on this waiting list? His mental health has worsened, he's lost contact with his family, his drug use is increasing. He doesn't want to tell anyone that he's struggling with his addiction, because if he asks for help, what's that going to mean for getting back up to top end? So he does get to top end, but he then fails another drug test, and this cycle goes on and on and on. And 20 years on, Bob is still in prison. And what we really want to do today is think about these two different stories and think about what that means for the people that live them. And you might be wondering, right, where do these stories come from? These stories really reflect what we're told by our community. So Scott gave a little bit of an introduction around Spark and who we are and what we do. We're a community interest company, which means we really work to serve our community, which is people who are most impacted by imprisonment. And we have done lots of work in prison education and prison reading groups, so we know lots of people that are living through this process. We also have people who write to us, who reach out to us on social media. We've had quite a lot of families reach out to us recently. So they reflect what we are hearing from our community. They also reflect prison statistics. I'm sure many, many people here are already aware that Scotland is a large outlier compared to the rest of Europe, that we have one of the highest prison populations in Europe. And that is in part driven by the fact that people are increasingly serving longer sentences. And although the Scottish Government data hasn't been as accessible as we might have liked over the last few years, and that there are still problems with it, we do know that sentence length is increasing. So these stories reflect the prison statistics that we have. They also reflect the academic research in this area. So there's a growing interest in research on progression and research on lifers in particular. And the UK is a European leader in terms of how frequently we use life sentences, alongside Albania, Greece, Turkey, and Ireland. So we're not, Scotland quite often aspires towards the Nordic countries, and we're not really in that group when it comes to life sentences. And similarly, I mean, that's the UK as the whole, but when we look at Scotland specifically, if we look at number of life sentences per 100,000 of the population, we're the European leader in 2016 because we have such a high population of lifers. Yet in the same year, only 12% of cases that were considered by the parole board were released. So we've got a range of sources, we're building up this picture that for many, many people, progression is quite difficult, that we don't have as many Adams as we would like, and that many people are experiencing a story similar to Bob's. So what I really want to do for the last little bit that I'm going to do before I hand back to Scott is I want to give you a flavour of what we think are some of the issues driving this. And we've been interested in this issue of progression for a really long time. So these are some of the ideas that we have around what causes these delays with progression. And before I do that, I just really want to flag up again, the reason why this is important is there are people's lives at the centre of this. But also, if we think about criminal justice systems, and Scotland aspires to have a rehabilitative criminal justice system, if we're committed to rehabilitation, how do we have two sentences that look so different? And these are some of the reasons that we think we might be in the situation that we're in. So we all know that the Scottish Prison Service had a fairly recent organisational review that really aligned the aims and goals of the service around rehabilitation, assistance, citizenship. And that's really, really important. But we also know that criminal justice systems, one of the key things they do, as well as aspiring to rehabilitation, is they set out to manage risk, right? And particularly amongst this group that we're talking about, long-term prisoners, lifers, this issue of risk is really central. And what we're arguing here is that in that context where rehabilitation and risk are overlapping and possibly working against each other, we argue that things that are health needs, mental health needs, physical health needs, addiction issues, these become seen as risks that have to be managed, right? Rather than health needs that should be supported and addressed. So when we think about Bob and him failing his drug test, the focus is very much on the fact that he hasn't lived up to the expectations that everybody would like him to, that he hasn't met the standards expected of him, and that he receives this punitive response of a downgrade. So while increasingly discussions around addiction are being moved towards this as a public health concern, and we see this right with the push in Scotland for safe injecting rooms and mobile injecting rooms. In a prison context, they can be seen as a risk to be managed, and very often they receive this punitive response. And it is a punitive response because what it does, as we've seen with Bob, is it adds time onto people's sentences. And as Scott said, if we think about imprisonment as the most severe and damaging punishment we can inflict on people, that is a really serious outcome. The other thing that we think shapes experiences of progression is staff relationships. And this again will be familiar to so many people here. prisons are a really complicated place to work. Very often, lots of things in prisons are still done on paper. You need to get lots of things in a line to get your progression moving, right? You need to have your ICMs and you have to have your RMTs and you have to be meeting your sentence plan. You need to, and to do that, you need to ask staff to do a lot of things for you, to chase up your paperwork, to arrange your meetings, to highlight things that you might be able to take advantage of to get you on the waiting list for programs. So staff relationships become really, really important in terms of shaping progression, which brings us on to our third point around communication and soft skills being really important. So if you're someone like Adam, who's engaged in education, who is got good family support, who isn't struggling with mental health, that is articulate, that's knowledgeable about their rights, that knows that they can contact the prison monitors, that can advocate for themselves and put their case across and build relationships that make people want to help them. All of that helps progression. Whereas conversely, if you're someone who has really difficult relationships with authority, poor interpersonal skills, problems with mental health, problems with addiction, disabilities, all of these people who already have more to deal with are then doubly disadvantaged because they don't have this advantage of communication skills. Finally, all of this is compounded by administrative factors, which I'm sure, again, are very familiar to people here. Waiting lists, they've been highlighted as something that is slowing progression and an issue of concern by both the Scottish Government and the Prison Inspectorate. So waiting for places on courses and the kind of confusion that creates and the frustration that creates that Chris mentioned when he was introducing us, which, you know, then impacts on your relationships with staff. And this all, you know, these all overlap and circle into each other. Delays with accessing placements and home leaves. We, as Scott said, we are a collective with a range of perspectives, but my perspective of this, of trying to arrange community placements, takes a really long time. Getting everything done, getting all the assessments done and paperwork in. And then the third administrative factor that compounds all of this is staff availability. So staff play such a key role in people's experiences of progression, but we also know that staff sickness has been a real issue in the SPS. So Audit Scotland described it as very high and rising. And what that also means is that staff who are working in teams that are impacted by this, those members of staff are doing lots of overtime, working really long hours. So if you're really stressed, really busy, really tired, being pulled in lots of directions, you don't have numbers of staff you might want, this then also impacts on progression. Okay, I'm going to hand over to Scott now.
Thanks, Cara. So really now the focus on the impact of COVID is really just touching on all the things that Cara's just mentioned, but obviously how that's going to be experienced by our community. So these are the most pressing aspects raised by our community in light of COVID and its impact on progression. Mental health has always been a really significant issue for the prison population. There's a really high prevalence on entry. Prison is also evidenced and linked to causing psychological harm, and this is particularly true for longer term offenders and the more time spent in custody. The uncertainty of the progression system has always been a significant stressor pre-COVID, as this first quote illustrates. And the additional impact now of COVID is such that a lot of people who are effectively doing everything right and doing everything that they can, jumping through the hoops, as they say, are now really left sort of treading water as courses have been suspended, meaning that critical dates can't be met. And this is true for most long-term prisoners who have parole dates, but it's particularly more acute for lifers, and that's a particular point for Scotland because of their high prevalence. They are not going to be able to hit their critical dates. So it's really unlikely that their parole dates are going to be able to be met through no fault of their own. So their sentences are likely going to be extended and become longer. For a public health issue that genuinely isn't their fault. kind of brings us on to the issues with staff. There's a quote here pointing out that services have been decimated. Obviously, there's fewer staff attending to things. They've been spread ever thinner. And that's leading to tensions on both sides. You know, you've got a group of really frustrated guys who are trying to make things happen, and they are now focused entirely on sometimes a skeleton staff who really didn't have the capacity to deal with it. And that's increasing the likelihood of negative interactions with staff, and that's a really difficult issue with somebody that you need to talk to get something that you want, and you can't risk having a bad interaction with, because this might potentially have a negative impact on your chances of moving on whenever that day may come. Can I get the next slide, please, Cara? Again, staff availability, similar to this. You know, we've got the same amount of prisoners as before, in a system that was already backlogged and failing when it was running at full capacity. And we now have the same amount of guys trying to access even scarcer resources in shorter time periods with fewer staff who, as we say, are really stretched. And all these things can intersect, you know. So the staff who would have been managing programmes are now contracted to work in the halls due to staff shortages and sickness as a consequence of COVID. So programmes are subsequently postponed, indefinitely in some cases. So guys are often interacting and arguing on a daily basis with the same staff they know deliver these programmes and could deliver these programmes, but are no longer sanctioned to do it. And this is all at a time when the majority of the prison population has been locked up for longer than ever, doing absolutely nothing meaningful with their time. So the sense from our community is that these guys, they can't help but really sort of feel the weight and the sort of the perversity, the impasse or the inaction and the wasted opportunity to do something meaningful with them during what is an unprecedented time. And many are reporting feeling far less hopeful, much more anxious and much more stressed. It's a really unfortunate cycle we've sort of fallen into, and unlike the other public health issues we've kind of raised that are being dealt with in a punitive fashion that we can come back to, but this one genuinely can't have the kind of moral weight placed on them. This isn't a failing on their personal behaviour. This isn't a bad decision that they've made. They're doing everything that's required of them. This is the Adams as well as the Bobs that are feeling the weight of this, and they're going to do more time as a consequence. Well, and back to Cara.
Back to me.
Yep.
Okay, so the last little section, we're going to just pull out some of the kind of implications and takeaways of this for people working in the system, and also for prison monitors in particular. And the key kind of takeaway that we want people to get from this is the implications of having a complicated and difficult to get through progression system. Really, what it means is that people are experiencing inconsistency. So these are not the difference in time that Bob is going to do compared to Adam. It's not relating to what brought them into prison in the first place, but they're having a very different experience in terms of, and it's not just months, it's like years, and sometimes 5 years, and sometimes up to 10 years. So people are having substantial amounts of time added to their sentence for things that don't relate to what brought them in the first place. And and that is concerning in of itself, right? If we say that we're a society committed to justice, fairness, and equity, you know, that's a real concern. But it's also a real concern because, as Scott said, you know, the Bobs are in this position because they already experience disadvantage and marginality. And we all know this, right? That people who are in the prison system typically have experienced trauma, violence, victimization, poor education, addictions, trauma, all of these things, right? And then that is then adding to the amount of time that they're then spending on their sentence. So that's a real concern for us, and that's why we've been interested in this issue of progression for so long. We also think that there's real issues here around how this is experienced for individuals and the question of hope. So anyone who's familiar with the desistance literature, which is really what underpinned a great deal of the SPS organisational review, is hope is really central to this idea of desistance, of changing your life, of wanting things to be different and creating a new life for yourself and the community. And people need hope to move on and change their lives. But how do you do that if you're stuck in this system or stuck in this loop? If you're Bob and you've been here before, you were back, you were in Top End 3 years ago, and you've had to cycle all the way through this and you're back again. How do you stay positive? And then if you are one of the people that is serving this very long amount of time that we're increasingly seeing in Scotland, how do you stay hopeful if you've done everything that you can do? If you've completed all the programs that have been asked of you, if you've completed all the educational sort of inputs you can do, or, if you think about employability and the work sheds and the opportunities that are available in the prison, very often that's geared towards getting people a job on release. What if you're now pushing 50, 55, 60, 65? How do you stay hopeful? And equally, think about that in relation to people's families. If your children have quite literally grown up and started a life of their own and you haven't been a part of that, how do you maintain a sense of hope? And we think that has got really meaningful implications for individuals, but we also think it's got implications for the system. So in terms of people working within the prison, if you're having to work with people who've become really institutionalized, that could be an increasingly challenging group to work with, partly because of all the impacts of institutionalization that you can imagine, of feeling like a lack of agency and a lack of control and a lack of hope. But also, if you don't feel hopeful that you're ever going to get out, why comply with the regime? So there could be real challenges there for managing people in prison, and also supporting them on release. And if you think about how much has changed in the last 5 years, never mind the last 10, 15, 20 years, how do you transition people back into the community when, now everything is digital by default, now we all work at home, now everything is on Zoom, your children are adults, how do you transition people back into that? So there's some real important implications, I think, around release and reintegration too. And finally, we've got some questions for you as monitors that Scott's going to speak to.
Yeah, so this first question we feel is relevant because the last time we spoke to the IPNs, we got them to play a game. That's why this paper is called Snakes and Ladders, and we quite literally devised a game board based on the game of Snakes and Ladders and allowed monitors to play. And every now and again, we'd hand them a card that gave them an addiction issue, a mental health issue, a bereavement, some cataclysmic life event. And that made it all the more likely that every roll of the dice they would end up back to the start of this game rather than making it through the progression. And the monitors were getting really frustrated and felt this was really unfair. And just because we wanted to give them an experience of that, and within half an hour they were hating the game and not wanting to play it anymore. So the reason this first question is posed the way it is because COVID is likely the closest thing to a prison sentence many of us who've never had any direct interaction with the criminal justice system could experience. It's the imposition on your liberty, it's a constant change in the rules, an experience of uncertainty. Potentially it's backlog and backlash for things that are deemed in the interest of the public good, but didn't maybe make a lot of sense to you, and you're trying your best and nothing's changing. So we would really like to ask is, has your own experience of COVID given you a new insight into how it feels to experience uncertainty, changing rules, a lack of autonomy, and restrictions on your freedom for the public good? And if it hasn't yet, we would ask that you maybe try and think of it in that way. Have you already seen factors such as mental health, addiction, staff relationships, communication skills, and COVID shape impact on progression? And we feel that's really important because a lot of people in the prison population don't have those soft skills. They're not in a position to articulate themselves. They don't know how to navigate the prison rules. They don't understand the intricacies of a bureaucratic system, the jurisprudence. They don't understand that. and it's difficult for them to speak to it without getting frustrated, without getting angry, and without that being then attributed to an interpersonal failure on their part. We would ask, how might independent monitors identify and intervene in these issues, knowing what they know about the data, about the statistics, and how might you help people maybe articulate their issues or take these things on board? And how can the many small interactions that shape a person's experience of their sentence and pace of their progression be understood as rights concerns? So again, we've kind of pointed out that we're dealing with public health issues as kind of failings, essentially moral failings or behavioural failings on the part of people who, in any other walk of life, this would be viewed as an illness. And again, as Cara pointed out, it's the link. It seems easy to make it initially, but the link between somebody who's serving a set period of time for a crime of violence at a particular point in their life in a specific circumstance, maybe say when they're in their teens or early 20s, to still be in jail when they're 50, having never committed a further violent act in custody, having never lifted a hand in anger, but having developed a drug issue over the course of that sentence, and consistently failing a battle with addiction. Does that really justify them 2-3 times as long in custody as they would have? And compounding the damage done by custody. That's a human rights issue, that's a public health issue. So that's really what we would ask you to think about before we go to the kind of quick and easy, oh well, you failed the drug test, so you went back the way, it's your fault. Yeah, that's it.
Chris, you're on mute.
Chris, you're on mute. Sorry, I was struggling to unmute myself there. Sorry.
Oh, the amount of times I've done that in the last 9 months, I'm sure we all have anyway. Okay. I was just saying to both Scott and Cara, thanks very much for the presentation. I think at the Inspectorate and for all the IPMs, that was very, very insightful, and it grounds us again in the practical application of what we aim to try and do at the Inspectorate. And the prison monitoring system was set up, and it's indeed enshrined in the legislation. It's a prisoner-centric system, and it's a good reminder that we should be doing that. I was thinking, as you went through your presentation, we speak about ensuring rights and decency are upheld, and it's a good reminder that individuals do have a right to have that progressive pathway through their sentence and to have a properly managed sentence. So there's a few questions that have came in during the course of your presentation. Also, thanks to Scott for flipping the presentation and posing a few questions to us. I think that will be really helpful going forward, because we can talk about progression, we can talk about how nuanced it is, and I know that Eddie will in a few moments. But we really need to get to the nuts and bolts about how we monitor that, and I think we can spend a bit of time after today thinking about how we do that. So a couple of queries from the Chief Inspector, just as your presentation was going on there. The first one probably isn't for an answer during this presentation and could be for away from today, but she's asking if SPARC would like to join us on the thematic review of progression in 2021 in order to more fully recognise the voice of those who have got lived experience of custody. So I think that would be a positive move. And the second thing Wendy was talking about was if in the COVID situation we're in a new position where we're looking for alternative suggestions as to how risk can be reduced and measured that are credible and innovative, would SPARC have practical solutions for that in terms of alternative ways of measuring and reducing risk? So those were the two questions from Wendy. Jill Long has got in touch also to talk about programmes, and I know Eddie will maybe make a bit of a distinction and a separation between programmes and various different parts of progression, but Jill highlights the waiting list for programmes, which comes to us a lot from prisoners. That's the first block, and the second part is about the efficacy, and does SPARC have a view on how effective these programmes are in terms of rehabilitation, as well as the waiting list to get on those. So if I could pose those in no particular order just now to either Cara or Scott.
Scott, do you want to talk to the one about efficacy?
This may be anecdotal, but there's enough of these anecdotes. If you build them, they build a picture. So I would like to say that During the course of my time in prison, I completed no offender programmes. I tried very, very hard to get on every offender programme possible because I was told that if I didn't complete these, I wouldn't move on. And I had a pretty long and arduous battle to kind of demonstrate that I was displaying the necessary skills. And it became incumbent upon me to really get to grips with the prison rules, to start knowing the ins and outs, the LSCMI scoring tools and everything that was available, so that when I consistently got told I couldn't get on a programme, when I eventually came to the point of moving on and people didn't want to move on because I hadn't completed one, which continued through every stage from close to top end, from top end to open, this constant back and forth, I at least had the argument and I had the patience. And arguably I'm doing quite well. I'm working, I have a family, I'm engaged in this kind of work, I'm pursuing a PhD, I'm completing a master's degree. I'm a relative success story in terms of what the SPS stands to do by unlocking potential and transforming lives. And I've utilised none of the approved schemes to do so. Instead, I went to things like education and utilised as much as I could in family contact and visits and stuff, the stuff that matters. Conversely to that, I've done several guys' constructs homework in the comfort of their cells, based on not actually having partook in any of the courses, but just learning enough of the buzzwords and the kind of office speak that people do to navigate situations, and these kind of non sequiturs about generating alternatives and visualising the old me versus the new. I mean, it should be pretty concerning that people are serving years over not being able to access these courses that are essentially just learning what to say and what not to say for 3 months, rather than any kind of demonstration of their behaviour over years observed in custody. And again, we can point to the failings of people with addiction issues and mental health concerns, but we have places in the community where we treat and deal with people with mental health issues and addiction concerns. We typically don't think somebody who's an alcoholic or a heroin addict who's just a user should be locked up in custody before they've committed a crime. I don't see why we should continue to double somebody's sentence because they have the same issues as someone in the community.
I just want to add to that, to really speak to Wendy's second question, which I think is a really brilliant question around how do we deal with this issue of risk in a climate where people can't access the things that the system says they need to do to demonstrate that they've reduced their risk. And this is just my personal view. The thing about Spark is we do everything collectively, so we haven't discussed this, but my personal view would be that that's a brilliant question. And also that we need to get people out from behind their doors, because the real problem that people face is they get told, okay, so you've got a really happy, stable relationship. It's not been tested in the community. You engage really well in education, but we don't know what that might be like in the community. Is it so, like working with someone like Scott, you would then get, is your plan for a PhD on release, is that realistic? Have you got a realistic sense of what you can achieve in the community? So I think that there needs to be space for other things to count as evidence for reducing risk, whether it's engagement with education, stable family relationships, positions of responsibility in the workplace. And I know these things all do, but for them to be given more weighting than they are, and to not be held back by the fact that you're assessing somebody's risk in a really artificial environment when you want to be able to see what they're going to be like on release. So there has to be some way to overcome that. And that's going to be very difficult to do if people are spending their time even more confined. So I guess it really does come down to what Wendy was saying, is we have to have less people in the system. We just have to, because otherwise, exactly like Wendy was saying, like at the end of her presentation, if we can only get guys out behind their door for 30 minutes in Berlin, how can you possibly evidence that you're not a risk? And the other idea on that would be then, let's flip the burden, right? Make the burden on the system to evidence that you still are a risk. As Scott was saying, right? Take the guy who's done something really violent when they were 19, who is now 36 and has got no incidents of violence. So why are we still keeping them? So flip the burden, right? Why are we still keeping them? Those would be some initial thoughts that I have, but fantastic questions.
Could I just add something briefly on risk? And it's particularly a sympathy to practitioners, and I think practitioners, the SPS, in particular social workers, probation officers, they're in the unenviable position of basically having the blame laid at their feet for not being able to predict things or minor events that they're not in a position to predict, and that none of the scoring tools or any of the further restrictions that have been ramped up in the wake of any sort of high profile events actually can predict. And that's the thing, you're held to account for something that's not in your power to control. You can't legislate against random acts, and that's deeply unfair. And people in the system, prisoners recognise that. You know, people in the justice system recognise that you're not in a position to control this, and it's part of what makes this relationship, for people who understand it, all the more frustrating, because it's like you're both kind of sitting there saying, we know this doesn't actually amount to anything, but the end result is it could cost you years. And it's a hard thing for guys who understand that to swallow, and it makes relationships difficult. And I don't know how we get out of that, because that's a wider cultural issue, that's a policy issue, that's a political issue that is neither the practitioner's fault or position to deal with, or the prisoner. But we're both at the pointy end of the justice system in dealing with these issues. So maybe working together rather than against each other is the way forward to address these kind of points.
I just have one thing to really quickly say, and I will be brief because I realise we've talked about this a lot. But when Chris introduced me, he said, I'm a lecturer in social work and social policy department. There's real parallels here with child protection. And I think we have to have an honest conversation around what systems can do. Systems can't remove risk. Systems can't ensure that no children are harmed. And systems can't ensure that nobody who goes to progression and parole will never reoffend. Like, they just can't do that. But we need to accept that and have an honest conversation about it, so that you don't have a situation like Scott's referring to, where you have really high profile events that then stop all of HDC, right? You need to accept that there will be things that happen, and have an honest conversation about that going forward.
I think there is a real cultural shift towards error terror, though. You see that in political decisions, in the rise in the sentences. And I think of the two cases of a young man kidnapping, raping and murdering a young girl. 15 years ago, that was a 12-year sentence. Now it's a 27-year sentence. I'm not arguing that it wasn't a heinous crime and we all feel safer with that person locked up. That's not what I'm arguing. But there is that shift in the long sentences, and some of that is the pressure that media, and particularly social media, can apply, which means we've got error terror. And it's exactly your point, Scott, about you cannot predict or mitigate against events. You really can't. But surely we don't let one event influence good practice elsewhere. And that is worrying. So, but thank you. I thought that was absolutely fascinating. I want to thank you in advance for everybody else. Really wonderful.
Yeah, I'm sure everyone on the webinar would echo that, Wendy. Thanks very much to Scott and Cara. We've got a lot of comments coming in, which we will aggregate and make sure are passed on to you if there's any further conversation that we can have, if that's okay with you two guys. Really a lot of food for thought, an awful lot in the presentation, and similarly an awful lot coming through from the comments from our prison monitors, members of our advisory group who are also getting involved in the conversation. So really very much thanks for a really thought-provoking presentation. I hope you can maybe stay on with us if you can. If it's okay with everyone, we'll take another quick 2 or 3 minute break. Our next speaker is from the Scottish Prison Service, so we like to be balanced at the Inspectorate. So where we push opinions and certainly some of the problems and issues that have been posed by our previous speakers are absolutely valid, and we hear them a lot as independent prison monitors. It's also incumbent on us to hear from the Scottish Prison Service and some of the responsibilities that they carry in terms of progression. So we'll hear from Mehdi in just a few minutes. So folks, if I can invite you back in really just 2 or 3 minutes, and we'll put Eddie on, and he can give us the SPS view on risk and progression. Thanks very much. Okay, just checking in. Can everyone hear me? I know we've got good numbers on the call. I think this morning, before Kerry Love went off, she was saying we had over 50 on the call, and I think we might have more now. So a really good level of engagement, which I think both speakers and presentations this morning have really kick-started the conversation for us as a group of independent prison monitors about how we might think about supporting and advocating for prisoners who are on that progression pathway, and also how we pose those questions to the appropriate people within the establishments in which you monitor. Next up is Eddie Cottress from the Scottish Prison Service. Eddie is the head of risk at SPS HQ. And even just in a brief conversation that Eddie and I had during the week as we were planning for the presentation, I came away knowing things that I didn't know previously. So I'm sure that's going to be the case as Eddie goes through his presentation here. Eddie, I'll hand over to you now, if you're ready.
Just unmute myself, make sure I've done that right. Yeah. Okay. So thanks, Chris. I'd just like to thank Wendy as well as yourself and everyone at HMIPS for the opportunity to speak today. From the conversations that I've had, the HMIPS reports I've reviewed, and hearing Wendy and the other speakers today, you all deserve massive credit for such a positive response to the horrible situation we've been going through, and we still are, and we're likely to be going through it for some time as well. I genuinely believe we will get through it, but it's not going to be without many complexities and a lot of necessary changes through the recovery journey. I just wanted to touch on something that Wendy said, and I'm fully supportive of her position on which people should and shouldn't be in custody. Sentencing a person to time in custody should be considered on the risk of harm or the risk of serious harm. And also the comments from the Scottish Prisoner Advocacy and Research Collective are useful as well, consistent with the intended direction of travel. I think the key here is let's separate need and conduct from what is risk. So, as Chris said, I'm Eddie Cottress. I just thought I'd maybe start with a succinct or potted history of my career, my current role and policy responsibility and engagement. I've worked for the SPS for 22 years now, and I started as an officer in HMP Glenorchy. And that's where I got my experience of working with people from complex and difficult backgrounds. That developed significantly over my years as an officer. I've covered all operational roles as an officer and first line manager, then as a residential and offender outcomes areas as unit manager. I've been in SPS headquarters since 2017, which is has flown by. And as head of risk, I've got current responsibility and policy responsibility for risk management, progression, temporary release, case management, MAPA and parole. So quite a broad portfolio of all complex areas. So as I've been fortunate enough to progress to my current role, I've never lost the desire to help and support people. You know, so I'm now in a position, excuse me, where I can shape policy and support the application of the policy to align with relevant corporate themes. I'm obviously responsive to political direction in that regard as well. Again, this comes with a number of challenges. Try to see them as opportunities positively. I'll come on to that a bit later on. And I work closely with key stakeholders in my current role, from Scottish Government, the Risk Management Authority, the Parole Board for Scotland, Community Justice Scotland, Criminal Justice Social Work, both community and prison based, Police Scotland and NHS, just to name a few. So before I focus on the current progression landscape, I wanted to set the scene a wee bit, and I think it's very important that I cover risk management, SPS policy and guidance position, and put that in a wee bit of context. So hopefully what I'm going to cover this morning will be useful for monitors in terms of discussion with people in custody across the estate about progression. I don't think it's a fix for it, but it just gives a bit of a flavour of where we are policy-wise, guidance-wise, and what we're hopefully going to do in the future as part of the recovery journey. So I want to focus a wee bit on more broadly on how processes should operate in practice. I'm not saying that we're there or anywhere near there on a number of fronts. So as Chris touched on as well, having had a pre-mate with Chris to scope out how I should prepare, I thought it might be useful to take the subject back to where the journey begins. Before I speak about the current progression landscape, as I said, I want to cover the risk part of it as well. Caveated, of course, by the SPS continuously being reactive to change in relation to risk management. And an example of that would be corporate response to a high-profile event such as a recent MAPA significant case review and the changes that are essential as a result of that. So I'll give you just a wee overview of what I'm going to cover. A number of points, some more briefly than others. I'm just mindful of the timings. I'm going to start with a high-level overview of a person's custodial journey, which has already been touched on from previous speakers. Then I'll move on to talk a little bit about risk management, a wee bit about the progression pathway for the different categories of people in custody, touch on the COVID-related impacts, the current position, and some of the next steps. So I want to open with a statement that is my own words, but it mirrors the SPS position or intended position. So I had given some thought, and I think it's the way I've captured it is through working with people in SPS care, case management and risk management, including consideration and support for progression, must be individualised, not generalised. And I think from my experience and from what I'm hearing today, from the feedback that I receive, I do get a lot of personal mail from people in custody. I get a lot of solicitor correspondence, and I do hear the messages that come across from that, and I do feel the frustrations. I think there's a lot of generalisation on our part, and there's a lot of perception of generalisation as well. So as I said, front loading that by saying SPS aren't there yet, and that's evidence from the feedback HMPS received during visits as well. I'll hopefully qualify some of my views through the following areas that I'm going to cover. So I've said not generalisation, but there are key periods in a person's time in custody that apply to everyone. So it begins with a period of identifying immediate needs through a core screen, and this happens through conversations with various staff and partners. We then move into a support phase, moving through assessment, referrals, intervention and engagement, and then ultimately transition to either less secure conditions or a return to the community. I just want to apologise. I can hear I've got two young pups, so I can hear them in the background whining. So apologies if you can hear that. All of this should identify risk factors, which I'll come on to again, and how these risks can be reduced or mitigated. And clearly, the longer the time a person spends in SPS care increases the depth of work required at each stage. So going back to my statement, why is it crucial to individualise this approach to be person-centred and assistance-focused? And I try to put the complex situation simply. Everybody has different levels of risk, need and responsivity. If any of these component parts in the journey are missing, then the impact is felt by the most important people in the process, and that is the person that's in our care. So this naturally brings me on to the next area I want to cover, and it's the Risk Management Authority's Framework for Risk Assessment, Management and Evaluation frame, and that was published in 2011, and I do promise it links to progression. So I want to hit the key points to give some understanding and signposting, so just in case there are maybe some attendees that haven't had the opportunity to read this document or have knowledge of it, and obviously apologies if everybody has. The aim of frame is a consistent shared framework that promotes defensible and ethical risk assessment and management practice that is proportionate to risk, legitimate to role, appropriate for the task in hand, and is communicated meaningfully. So just reflecting on Wendy's earlier comment on the dependency on offending behaviour programmes, that's a key link here and the future of progression. All of the work we do in relation to risk management within the SPS has to align with the foundations of the frame approach. Again, definitely room for further development here. So that brings me on to the language of risk, and this is important because it communicates an understanding and values. Within frame, it captures it in a way that really sets it home. Again, this is a lift from frame. Descriptions of risk should be clear and unambiguous, and should inform the decisions and actions that the listener or reader needs to take. Then it goes on to say, If we describe people as high risk, we may diminish our appreciation of the individuals, their lives, challenges, strengths, and personal characteristics to a collection of risk factors. Conversely, a person described as low risk may seem to merit little recognition. Neither would be consistent with the commonly held value of respect or unconditional positive regard. Again, the reason I've lifted that verbatim is because I couldn't put that any better, you know, and it's continuously, it comes across in various arenas that people are described as high risk or medium risk or low risk. It doesn't personalise it. So really, some really difficult and evident challenges when communicating risk. And this extends beyond the SPS to the parole board, for example, and it is impactful on decision making. So linking frame to the high level journey I discussed earlier of the person's time in custody, the work that is undertaken is risk assessment, analysis, evaluation, formulation and management. And through this process, all progression considerations should balance the risk factors, the strengths and the protective factors in order to make decisions on manageability and less secure conditions. Again, coming back to that, there is clearly work to be done there. And likewise, this needs to be the focus for parole board decision making when applying their tests for release, for example. And then when you reflect on this and that process that I've discussed, assessment, analysis, evaluation, formulation, management, balancing the risks with the strengths and protective factors, programme completion in itself becomes less of a dependence straight away. It would only be considered as one protective factor, for example, where there's many others that are of equal or far greater significance in relation to desistance. So I'll come on to risk management in SPS now. Risk management progression and temporary release is governed by our guidance document that was reviewed in August 2018, and how we support our risk management teams is through the supplementary guidance for decision makers involved in the risk management process, and that was released in December 2018. And both of these guidance documents link directly to the RMA's frame document as well. They are subject to continuous review, as I say, in respect of significant case reviews and anything that falls out of the recommendations that we've committed to corporately for entirely the right reasons. The risk management team itself is a multidisciplinary team of professionals that represent a range of agencies involved in the management of people in custody, and that includes psychology, social work, health and external partners. Whilst the risk management team covers all areas of risk management, in particular for progression cases, the RMT is making decisions on the transfer to less secure conditions at our top end facilities, Castle Huntly, Open Estate, or community integration units. And in addition to that, or for community access for people in custody. And an interesting point again here to be considered is that the standard criteria to be considered for progression does not include programme completion in there. I say considered for progression. So you have to be aware that there are areas that are not currently treated in SPS as well. So decisions must be based on manageability of risk. So Scott's comments earlier are really true, and certainly are on my agenda from a policy perspective going forward during this recovery journey. The progression pathway itself differs for every category of person in custody. So touched on the last presentation that anybody that's serving a life sentence, it's the tariff date minus 4 years before you can get to that point. And within that time, you have to have evidenced that the risks that you have are going to be manageable in less secure conditions. It differs for people serving long-term sentences and order for lifelong restriction, and any people that are serving short-term sentences as well, which interestingly I note that doesn't seem to be the focus from any of the speakers today. There hasn't been a lot on that yet. So we apply the progression pathway, and clearly from the case examples, there are times when it has worked, and there are times when it hasn't worked. I'll come on to the impacts of progression, but I just hope that you can start to see the thread of the complexities, that there is no generalised journey for a person in custody, because everybody has different risks, everybody has different needs, responsivity, concerns, and their response to that as well. Touching on the COVID impacts on progression itself, it was quite early into the pandemic that during lockdown that a number of restrictions were implemented. We've touched on it already in some of the other speakers, that integrated case management was affected, risk management team business was affected, offending behaviour programmes were suspended, transfers to less secure conditions didn't happen, they were suspended as well, work placement, special escorted leave and home leave. So all the key areas, if you will, in relation, and visits too. So not that, you know, the link with families is a key protective factor in there, and supportive factor in their strength for people in custody. So when all of these things are taken away, there is clearly a significant impact. Some positives in that regard were that we managed to quickly shift to, and Wendy's touched on this as well, to business critical functions happening. You know, so we've done integrated case management, case conferences and RMT business in a different way. We collaborated really well with the Parole Board for Scotland to deliver a business as usual model, moving straight away to teleconferencing. We resumed for a short period some face-to-face hearings, and we're looking at technical solutions for video conferencing facilities into the future, and we're almost there with that regard as well. You know, so that the parole business side of things has not been affected. What is likely to be affected is the board's capacity to make decisions on release, as they've cited to the Justice Committee. In addition, we've collaborated well with the Scottish Government and Social Work Scotland to extend the validity of home leave reports from 6 months to 12 months. So people that were already in the progression journey, we don't have to, you know, from November 2019, we don't have to go back and get a further home leave report, for example. So that should alleviate some concerns in that regard. And the focus on programmes being suspended, yes, they were, but what that allowed for was a number of psychological risk assessments that had been sitting on a separate waiting list to be undertaken. So all work didn't cease. Moving on to the current position, we resumed RMT business, full RMT business back in July, and the recovery work for the caseload, that the backlog of cases has significantly reduced. So the prisons across the estate have made a fair dent in their recovery journey. Transfers to the open estate recommenced on August the 16th. And interestingly, just a stat that I can give you here is that in the same period last year, August to November, we're sort of on par with the number of transfers that the people that have moved to the open estate. So since resumption transfers, you know, we're consistent again with and compliant with public health advice, our physical distancing policy, so that the numbers are limited to the people that can transfer in any given week. Offending behaviour programmes, those that were suspended at the start of lockdown, are resuming. And again, this is aligned to the SPS route map and latest public health advice under continuous review. So we are on that recovery journey. It's just disappointing that we've had further restrictions this week, as we're all aware from the First Minister's statement, and they take effect from 6 PM today. So there may be some knock-on effect of that in certain areas. Areas of note for me from a policy perspective and on behalf of SPS are the first granted temporary release process and progression to open state applications for people that are serving life sentences. There are a number of these that are sitting on the system, and that sits within my area. There is a plan now in place to reduce the backlog of that, and I know that that's a lot of the questions that the monitors will be asked, and certainly from conversations that I've had with a couple of these, and the letters I receive, you know, the solicitor correspondence, that is an area of concern. Home leave, you know, we've not managed to resume home leave yet, and the likelihood is that will be delayed further given the current restrictions. And then parole decisions moving into 2021 are likely to change slightly. So I just wanted to cover what's next then for SPS, and for me it's clear that policy and guidance being fit for purpose, and this is from my experience, policy and guidance being fit for purpose in itself won't fix any of the key issues. There's a number of variables and complexities that impact on practice, timescales being met, you know, but there are opportunities to do things differently. So what we need to do is have a holistic consideration of evidence and risk reduction and manageability for progression to less secure conditions. Again, that dependency on offending behaviour programmes when it's really just a small part needs to shift. And this can only work through supporting people to understand that and apply the principles of frame, risk management, and the SPS progression pathway. So this starts at people joining SPS like I did 22 years ago, right through to risk management team members and SPS decision makers. It can only be achieved through collaboration, and it can only be achieved by treating every person individually and proportionately. We aren't there yet. A main opportunity in here for me, and certainly on my agenda, is to increase user voice and engagement in shaping policy, training and support, and working with partners to look at these other ways to shape decisions on moving people on, and ultimately giving the parole board enough evidence to suggest that risks are manageable in the community. And that's me.
Great, thanks very much.
I was trying to get us back onto the time there. I was efficient sales. I've done all right, I think, time-wise.
You've done brilliantly. You've taken up 29 minutes of your 30, so thanks for staying on track there, Eddie. That was great. And don't worry about the dogs, you were perfectly clear where I am anyway, so it's a nice wee backdrop. There are a few questions that came through, Eddie, if you've got another 10 or 15 minutes, if that's okay.
Yes, certainly, of course.
So one is really just quite a basic one about timelines from Karen, who's a IPM at Greenock, and she's asking about a date for resumption of offender programmes. And I know you've spoken about that not being the real critical thing in regards to progression, but is there a time in mind at SPS? Yeah, so whilst it's not my policy area, the communication is that, as I had said, that this month into next, the programmes that were put down at the start of the pandemic will resume, and then the view is to optimise programme delivery into 2021 thereafter. So there's the programmes that were suspended, 1-to-1 and 1-to-1 and 2-to-1 work are resuming. Currently that's in train just now. Okay. And there's a slight corollary to that from Mark at Berlini. He's asking about how resources for delivery of programmes are allocated across the 15 prisons. Is that local discretion for governors as to how they allocate resources, or the SPS do a lot of that? I know there's certain programmes are delivered in certain prisons, Eddie. So SPS has a programme strategy group, and that oversees the delivery of programmes and where they're delivered and when. So that the communications in that regard come from there, and linked to that are the staffing complements for prisons in relation to programme delivery as well. Okay. I think Dean had asked as well about you'd mentioned about the current restrictions. Could you just say a little bit more about what impact that does have? I know Dean was specifically asking, I think, about home leave.
Yeah.
And specifically the restrictions that are coming in at 6 o'clock tonight, what impact do you anticipate that they will have?
I think a communication is currently being drafted, and that will come out through governors in charge and then to partners as well. It's, you know, that have policy responsibility, so that sits with colleagues in another directorate, but I understand the communication will come out, and then it will be communicated to partners as well, and, you know, everybody, that all stakeholders. So apologies, I can't really give an answer to that one.
Okay, so let's sort of watch this space. Well,
Yeah.
could I maybe just ask a question? I alluded to it, I think, when I had a conversation with you, and I hope this captures what some of the IPMs find as well, Eddie, where
Yeah.
and ideally in a framework like this, there would be the kind of seamless communication and application of policy between local establishments and SPS HQ. And I know from my own experience speaking to people in custody when I've been doing monitoring visits, and I know a lot of the IPMs will be the same, there sometimes feels like a wee bit of a disconnect. So the local establishments might say, oh, that's sitting with HQ, we don't really know, we've submitted our application, we've ticked our boxes at the local establishment, and then monitors might be in a little bit of no man's land in terms of what they can communicate back to prisoners who have made the request to see us.
Yeah.
Do you have a view on that in terms of how that disconnect might develop, or even if there is one?
Yes, so we're certainly working on that from a headquarters perspective. The prisons that submit, like if we're looking at applications that come into the centre, so that predominantly is the people that are serving life sentences, you know, progression for long-termers, those serving long-term sentences or short-term doesn't come through SPS headquarters, and OLRs are managed by their risk management plan as well. So for the people that are serving life sentences, we're working with prisons just now. We're going out there. I certainly at the start of the pandemic had the opportunity to go to Greenock. I held a couple of focus groups with the guys. I then put out personal letters to everybody that was on the waiting list. However, you know, I'll be honest here, that a lesson learned in that regard. I'd done that with the right intent, but it resulted in receiving countless personal letters in return, and constantly having to do that. And, you know, we've got a finite resource, and they are treated as official correspondence. So the time that I'm spending, or my small team is spending, responding to those letters, and rightly so, because you know, the people have a given right to have answers. You know, not having an answer is the worst thing in the world. It must be a horrible feeling not to know what you need to do. But as I said, I try to speak to the prisons to say that delays any work getting done, because there are only so many hours in the day across people. So if you've got the personal letters, the solicitor correspondence, that, you know, that all these things going on at the same time, it detracts you from actually reviewing the person's plan, the person's risk assessment, you know, correlating these. And the reason there is a high level of scrutiny is in response to when things have went wrong in the past. I would never want to hold anybody up from progressing to less secure conditions. You know, if it is the appropriate thing to do, I really wouldn't. Any scrutiny that's placed on applications is with the person's interests at heart, to give them the best opportunity to succeed in less secure conditions. And oftentimes that there are gaps in you know, what is submitted and where it needs to be. So we work behind the scenes with the prisons, with the risk management teams, with the LLOs, that, you know, the managers that are responsible for the case management, in order to get applications to the required standard. So it is really frustrating for the guys, and I hear that, and I try my best to answer all these things individually, but it does have a further impact on us.
Great, thanks, Eddie. I think there was one more question just around about that holistic consideration of risk, and where you see that moving, and if there's been that policy change? Because I think rightly or wrongly, and it's been interesting to hear you speaking about not having a dependency on programmes today. I think maybe as a body of monitors, we do focus a little bit on availability of programmes and waiting lists for programmes. How far do you think the SPS have moved towards that holistic assessment of risk and being able to take a number of other things into consideration?
If nothing else, the pandemic will force that. You know, this situation will force that. Interesting. I mean, the thing about waiting list, I didn't see. I've not seen a massive increase yet in waiting list, because I don't think there would have been that. Well, I've seen the data. There's not that many programmes assessments that had been carried out, you know, during the first few months from end of March to the summer. So whilst they will increase, it's not yet massively impacted. We know there are key areas of the programme work that the waiting lists are longer than others. But as I said, if you want to treat risk, well, one, the first part of that is put the right people in custody, and two, when we are you know, assigning in or referring in to these offending behaviour programmes, we need to look at balancing the risk that the person, you know, is it proportionate to the risk that's presented from a proper assessment as well. So,
and maybe just lastly from me, it's probably a naive question, and it depends on the prisoner, I suppose. Would prison officers be taking into consideration things like compliance with the COVID restrictions in the prison in terms of a prisoner's risk, or is that too low level at the moment? Is that part of these alternative solutions, or not really?
You know, everything has to be considered. That's why it's a holistic approach to it. We're not there yet. You know, I can't commit to timescales or anything like that. But you know, as I said, the guidance has been there since 2018. But what I would say is that meeting the standard criteria in itself, you know, the things like, you know, no negative drug tests and no misconduct reports greater than a caution, willing to transfer, all that sort of stuff, that in themselves, they are like the first part of that. If the person hasn't had the risk properly assessed to get an understanding, likewise, you know, balancing off to say that someone has completed a programme but has got nothing else, you know, positive currently through their engagement, or unfortunately for them, would still perhaps be more at risk than someone that's not done a programme but has several other protective factors in there. So that's the discussions that need to go through the risk management team, where you've got that multidisciplinary panel of professionals and experts in order to make a defensible decision and the right decision to move people on. And I know that's a difficult situation for us to be in. There's a public perception of that, there's a political perception of that, but this is definitely the opportunity to start making a difference, you know, and putting the person at the centre of that. That sits as a corporate, you know, under our corporate themes, the person-centred approach to that. So, yeah, and we will work towards that.
Thanks very much, Eddie. I think that's all the questions we have live at the moment. No doubt as our monitors and attendees digest a lot of what you've said, there will be a few more come through, so we might pass them up to you at some point next week. But
not what I said, not what I said about this. No, I'm only kidding. Of course, happy to receive, and if there are things that I've not covered today, then happy to pick up separately with you guys as well. But thanks very much for letting me join.
No.
And is it all right if I don't want to be ignorant for the following speaker, but I do have another meeting, if that's all right.
Of course, that's absolutely fine. Thanks again for the time, much appreciated.
Thanks everybody. Thank you. See you later. Bye.
Okay, I hope people found that useful to hear the SPS overview of how they are attempting to manage risk and ensure that the progression pathway isn't stalled to any great degree during this pandemic, although we know that there's obviously been issues. You just hearing Eddie go through the list there about programmes, transfers, work placements, specially escorted leave, ICMs and RMT business affected. That is a lot. That is a big change to their business, and it's encouraging to hear that the backlogs are are being addressed and there is a plan in place. But obviously that is something that will continue to be of interest to us as independent prison monitors as we go on. I know just from as we gradually go back into the prisons, we're already getting those requests about progression. So no doubt as you ease back into your monitoring practice, you'll be hearing about that yourself. So we'll certainly try to keep an eye on that. If you do have any more questions about anything that Eddie said, I know he's referenced a few documents and guidance in there as well, which might be good for us to refamiliarise ourselves with. If you do have any questions about it, then feel free to get in touch with your coordinator or any of us at HMIPS, and we can try and get some of that information out. I think we're on time, so we've got a bit of a break in the schedule for the moment. Yeah, I note your comment, Jacqueline. I think it would be good to get a summary of all the presentations, and we'll do that and get that out to you, because there was probably quite a lot of technical things in there from Eddie's presentation, so we'll do that. Just in terms of the schedule for today, I really do hope you can all hold on. We've got a slight departure from the progression theme when we reconvene, and Cara Jardine is joining us again. We're going to remain on the progression topic, but we're going to think about the impact of families, and Cara will speak to that based on some of the research she's done for our book that's just recently been released. So I think that's important again, if we're speaking about the holistic impact of imprisonment and progression, then families is a big part of that. And also, as Eddie mentioned, families and family ties are good protective factors for people in custody as well. So I'll look forward to that presentation. I don't have the agenda in front of me, but we're bang on time. So if we can come back after our lunch break, and we'll have Dr. Cara Jardine is going to speak to us about families, progression and imprisonment. Thanks very much.
Chris, you're on mute. I don't know if you're talking, but you're on mute. I don't think Chris realizes he's on mute.
I do now. Okay, welcome back, everyone. I hope you had a good break. We're really aware at the Inspectorate that this isn't quite the same opportunity to have peer support and to share practice as you would normally have if we were congregating somewhere centrally to talk as a national group of monitors. So we're looking at HMIPS in terms of ways that we can do that over the coming months. Now, obviously, in terms of social gatherings, that's probably not going to be possible, but it is important that we don't miss out on that aspect of being able to share your monitoring practice and think about what is going on for you all as you go into the 15 different prisons around the country. So rest assured, we'll be looking with Graham Neal, our training manager, as well at the Inspectorate, and everyone else as to how we can get an opportunity for you to do that going into 2021, whatever that looks like. So thanks for returning and rejoining us for the webinar. I thought the speakers this morning were excellent. We've had some excellent feedback from all the attendees so far, and certainly food for thought and some actions for us to follow up at the Inspectorate in order to really try and empower you guys as monitors to go into the prisons and to look at progression in as detailed a way as possible. As I said in the prelude to Eddie coming on there, that it's not our job to make sure that progression happens, but it's our job to highlight where there may be barriers or sticking points, and also to be as knowledgeable as we can be about the various different junctures in sentence progression. So hopefully this is a bit of a kickstart to look at that, and we'll certainly try and get the relevant documents and information out to you when you go back into the jails over the next few weeks and months. So our last presentation is Cara again, which we're delighted about. So I'd noticed during the week when I was talking to Cara about her presentation that there was a bit of online bluster about the cost of mobile telephones and a bit of tabloid conjecture about how much that had cost, and Cara had responded very robustly about the importance of the implementation of mobile telephones, which I don't think any of us will have heard anything other than positive commentary about from prisoners. We know there's been a couple of minor security issues, as prison managers would have expected over the last few months, but in general it's been a great connective thread for prisoners and those in custody to their families. So picking up on that, we'd asked Cara to come in and talk a little bit about the importance of families in light of the fact that she has just published a new book about families imprisonment and legitimacy. So speaking to Cara during the week, we'd thought, where is the tie-in in terms of progression with families? I know as monitors going into prisons, you will always speak to prisoners, you will always speak about their own families. You'll have been in the visit room when families are there and loved ones are there, and it's an important aspect of life in all of the prisons in Scotland. So we thought we'd just kickstart a conversation about how the two are interlinked and what our interface with families are at the Inspectorate as well. We work closely with families outside at the inspection level, probably less so at the monitoring level. And to that end, we've asked Cara to deliver a talk and a presentation to close off our annual conference today. So I shall hand over to you now, Cara.
Thank you so much, and thanks for having me, and thanks for everyone who's stayed around on Friday after lunch slot to hear this presentation, so thank you. I'm just going to share my screen because I've got some slides that I want to use while I'm talking today. Because as we were saying at the start of the Spark presentation, we're really keen in Spark to have the voices of people who are affected by these issues heard, and I would say the same for me as an academic, as a researcher. It's really, really important that the voices of families are heard. So I'm really happy to be here today. And I've got some slides so you can see some of the things that families are saying. And the research that this is from, as Chris was saying, it's just come out as a book. If you want to read it, I would hold off until March because it's going to come out in paperback, which is much more affordable than a standard academic textbook, which is outrageously expensive. So the research behind it wasn't intended to look at progression. It really was looking at the questions of, when we talk about families affected by imprisonment, who are we talking about? What are those impacts? And what are the things that could change or be done better? So that was really what the research set out to do. But I am going to flag up some things today as I'm talking that are relevant to progression, that I think are relevant to today and your roles as monitors. And I'm also going to try and stick to time, but this is my favorite topic to talk about, so that'd be quite challenging for me. But I'm going to try and stick to time. But if there's things that I don't cover that you want to ask me about, I'm very findable. I'm very, as Chris said, vocal on Twitter. You can also email me at my Strathclyde address. So yeah, very happy to follow up with anything that I don't get a chance to cover. So as I said, one of the first questions that the research really set out to look at is this idea of who are prisoners' families, because families affected by imprisonment have become much more visible in the research and policy and practice around imprisonment, which is a huge positive, but they're very often thought of in quite a narrow view of the family. So very often thought about as sort of your youngish man in the jail with a girlfriend or wife outside with youngish kids. That's really, so that really nuclear view of the family is the one that sort of persists quite often through research, policy and practice with families affected by imprisonment. But all the research around sociology of the family and probably what everybody sees in their own day-to-day life experience, as families are much more diverse than that, and the sort of nuclear model of the family is declining as a dominant model of the family. So I did interviews with people in prison and asked them who was important to them. And they talked about a huge range of people. They talked about step-parents, stepchildren, cousins, aunts, uncles, friends, members of their church community, their pets. All of these people came into what people were describing as family. So there's real kind of heterogeneity and diversity across what people think of as family. But there were also important commonalities. And the really important commonalities were, although all of these people are affected when someone goes to prison, there tends to be someone who takes on the lead caring role in terms of coordinating visits, putting money in PPC, buying property, handing that in, making sure you're in for phone calls. And very often that person is either a wife or a girlfriend or a mother. So of all the family members that I spoke to, and the only criteria was that you are supporting someone in prison that you think of as family and you'd like to talk to me, all but one of the adult participants was a woman. So they tend to take on this kind of key caring role. And then the other commonality that's really important amongst the families who took part in the research is virtually all of my families that took part were living in poverty and experiencing social marginality to a greater or lesser degree. So some people, and that was the direct consequence of a family member being in prison. Other people, I had quite a lot of younger women participating who said, you know, I was never very good at school. Education's not something for me. I haven't really found my way into the workforce yet, the workplace yet. People also were struggling with addictions, struggling with mental health. So really, people were experiencing quite real and deep social marginality. And that's really important because families are often seen as a way to sort of support resettlement. And we've had a lot of that conversation today, as families as a protective factor. But in terms of seeing them as a resource who's going to provide housing, jobs, social capital, that actually is really problematic because these families are already managing quite a high level of social marginality themselves. And then moving on to the second question that I wanted to talk about around what is the impact of imprisonment for families. It's just really important to flag up from the outset that imprisonment is really difficult for families and creates huge problems in their lives, which are very challenging to deal with over and above the poverty and social marginality they're already experiencing. So I just put some quotes from interviews with families on the slide. So, you know, just even like the emotional fallout, Sophie, who's a young mum, she says, I feel like everything's been ripped away from me and I've got nobody. It's the worst feeling ever, but there isn't really anything I can do. Bill, who was supporting his stepson, so he's the only adult man who participated in the research. He's talking about the breakdown of his relationship with his partner, and then that puts a whole huge strain on you. And then his benefits weren't correct, and then you had to deal with Department of Work and Pensions, and I don't understand the language they're using, and I can't pay my gas and electricity, and I need to get more help for that. So there's kind of double there of, so Bill had learning difficulties. So there's the sort of loss of the relationship, the loss of income because your benefits changed, then navigating all of that in a system you don't understand, as well as supporting your child through a custodial sentence. Other quotes on the slide. So I interviewed a whole family together, and the grandmother of that family, she's saying, I know that my son has done something wrong and he deserves to be punished, but there were journalists waiting for us outside court. They put photos everywhere. It was all in the news. We tried to protect the children from this, but we can't when, you know, this is being publicized everywhere. And that, you know, was felt as real punishment to us. And also the last quote on this slide is quite an extreme example, but it's from an interview with a person in custody who would be described as like quite high profile, I guess. And he said, you know, because my offence was so high profile, my mum's been victimised in the community, people spat in her face, my house has been shot up, my dad's been stabbed, I've been stabbed, all of this off the back of my offence. So it's not just me that's victimised, it's everyone who's victimised. And I think that just paints a picture of some of the multiple ways that imprisonment and the offence behind it can have really damaging impacts for families. Many of you will probably have heard this sentiment before, right? This was really common. When I was doing the research, I did interviews with people in custody and interviews with family. I also spent a huge amount of time hanging around a prison visitor centre. I spent like over 300 hours. And this was something that was commonly said to me, this idea that we do the sentence too. So Jackie says, you know, people up here, we're all in the same circumstances. Their lives revolve around visits and phone calls and making sure that he's got enough in his PPC. You know, this has become my life because it's had to. And this, I think, really speaks to the experiences of lots of family members who devote huge amounts of time to traveling to visit, wait to visit, go to the visit, travel home. That is done at the convenience of the institution rather than what fits into their life necessarily. They wait in for phone calls because calls to mobiles are very expensive. They travel to hand in property at times that's allowed. They have to go buy property that's acceptable to the prison rules. So it's a huge amount of work that people put into supporting somebody in custody. And that to them, it feels like the criminal justice system is exercising power over them, like they are like literally sentenced as well. And the thing that's really interesting for today is some of the family members supporting people doing a long sentence. I interviewed a woman, Susan, who's supporting her son through that. She says, you know, I feel like I'm wishing my life away because I'm thinking in the summer it's his next ICM, and then in 18 months, maybe he can get up to open, and then he can come on, then he'll get SELs, and then maybe 2 years away, then maybe we'll get him home. So that feeling of I'm just like wishing my life away until this sentence is over. I'm doing this time too. So that is the sort of context that I want to set out for the rest of what I'm going to say, right? So families were already experiencing quite high levels of poverty and social marginalisation. The offence and the imprisonment of the person in their family, that is very, very personally challenging and practically challenging, creates huge practical problems. All the families who I interviewed with children in them, their caring arrangements had to change somehow. People became homeless, they lost their relationships. So there's a huge amount of disruption and difficulty in their lives. They feel this kind of imposition of a prison sentence on top of that. And that is the context that I want you to kind of keep in mind with the rest of the things that I'm talking about. So in the next little section, I'm going to set out some of what I would argue are the harms of custodial penalties for families. And the first one really is that we are talking about families who are already coping with poverty, and supporting somebody through a prison sentence makes that worse. And it is important to say that families affected by imprisonment are not all the same, and this was a small scale qualitative study, so there will be families that this is not the case for. But when we think about the kind of characteristics of the prison population, we disproportionately imprison people from poor communities. So we shouldn't be surprised if lots of families are in these circumstances. So here, Joanne is talking about, Joanne was one of my participants who was in work, but she then gave up her job because her daughter and her daughter's partner, they were both sentenced at the same time. They had a very, very young baby daughter, like a few months old baby daughter. So Joanne gives up her job so that her granddaughter doesn't go into care. So she says, you know, I gave up my job, I end up on the dole, so I get £60 a fortnight. On top of that, her expenses go up really rapidly at this point. And that's not just about caring for the baby. She is also keeping her daughter's tenancy going. So her daughter's serving quite a short sentence. So Joanne's paying all the bills in her house to make sure she's got something to go to. And here she's talking about the financial support which is in place for families, and it's really minimal. So she's talking about the assisted visiting scheme. And she says, I get a whole £3 a month from the prison service because I can only claim for 2 visits, even though I do 8. So the other 6 I have to pay for myself out of the £60 a week. She says, not that I mind, I don't mind. And similarly, Alicia, she's another mom supporting an adult son through a long sentence. And she's saying, I give him £60 a week. And I get £60 a week in my benefits, and I give him £20 a fortnight. But because that's not enough to pay for canteen and phone and PPC, his sister, who's a young adult, she gives him £20 a fortnight. And then when his little sister gets a job, she'll do this too. So there's a few things that's really notable about this. Imprisonment is entrenching poverty for people who are already poor. These people tend to be women, so this entrenchment of poverty is gendered. For Alicia, this is through a really long sentence, so this is going to go on for a really long time. And that cost is going out beyond Alicia onto her other children who are young people who should be like setting up their own lives, but they're having to put more money into the prison because otherwise it's impossible to maintain family contact. Another thing that Alicia raised in her interview, which is really interesting and really relevant to today, is, as I've sort of alluded to all the way through this, families are not just putting financial resource into supporting somebody in custody. They're putting a huge amount of time and effort into doing this. But alongside that time and effort, which is important because that also reduces the opportunities they have to spend time and effort on their own goals and things they'd like to pursue to themselves, they're putting in a huge amount of emotional work, right? So they're really worried about the person in custody. That's what a lot of families wanted to talk about, that I'm really scared about how they're managing, how they're coping. And here Alicia's talking about how difficult it is for her son doing his programs. So he's doing group work for sex offenders. And she says he talks to me about it, and I find that really difficult, and I don't actually want to listen to this, but I do it because then at least he's getting it all out. And she doesn't want him to say anything to criminal justice professionals that might jeopardize his progression. So she'd rather that he spoke to her, but she finds that really hard. And then she's still worrying over and above that all the calls home are recorded. So is something going to be taken the wrong way or taken out of context? So yeah, families are doing a huge amount of emotional work that's often not really seen and not really recognised. And because this is so gendered, you can kind of think about this in terms of like standing by your man, right? And this is one of the problems about having all of this work, this key role of caring and supporting a person in custody, done by women, because women already disproportionately do the most caring in families. And this sort of entrenches the expectation that women should and take on this caring work. But alongside that, imprisonment disrupts family relationships in really important ways that both of these quotes speak to. Because it makes it very difficult, even though families outside are putting in huge amounts of time, energy, resource, worry, concern, support into getting somebody through their sentence. It is really, really hard to maintain a sort of open and reciprocal relationship when somebody is in prison. And everybody spoke to me about this, both families and people in custody. So your family contact is restricted. You can't see them as much as you'd like. You can't talk to them as much as you'd like. Very often, and this is why mobile phones are so important, and my response on Twitter might have been so robust, is there's a real lack of privacy in a prison context. If you're using a hall phone that's out in the landing and everyone else is queuing for that, there is no privacy there. You know, there's very little privacy on a visit. So it's very difficult for people to maintain open relationships. And this quote from Ewan kind of speaks to that. And part of this is some of the difficulties that we touched on of like coping with a long sentence. He's saying it was easier for me not to think about outside and not to think about my family and not to think about my mum. I kind of pushed them away. stuck my head in the sand. And it's only in the last couple of years that I've made a real conscious effort to try and start building that relationship up again. So it can be like family contact is so important, but can actually be kind of difficult and painful as well for people who are doing really long sentences and seeing life go on without them. But then similarly for families in the community, they very often felt like the person in prison didn't understand the situation they were now living with. So the relationship felt unbalanced that way too. They felt like they were giving a lot of support, but they weren't necessarily receiving that support back. So here, Leah is talking about how she's talking about her husband and saying, you know, it's all right for him in there. He doesn't have any worries. I give him £20 a week. He's well kept. He doesn't have any responsibilities. It's us that suffer, not him. He's probably enjoying the break while I'm being punished. And then I ask her, you know, do you think he knows how hard it is for you? Leah's caring for 5 children on her own. And she says, he couldn't imagine how hard it is for me. I couldn't even say it in words. So it's very, very difficult to maintain sort of ordinary, open, happy, reciprocal family relationships in the context of imprisonment. And the reason that I wanted to bring that up today is, one, to really flag up that family relationships aren't static, they change over time. So you see that with Ewan, where he says, I had a point where I was really limiting contact with my mum because that was really difficult and painful for me. But now I've built it back up. So relationships change over time, but they're changing over time in the context of the prison, and the prison as an institution feeds into that, right? Of how well are people in prison managing, how well supported are they, what opportunities they've been given to maintain their family contact. And similarly for families, like think about Alicia and all that work that she's doing, supporting her son, who's supporting her through that. So if we start talking about families as risk factors and protective factors, you have to recognize that family contact in the context of this is not neutral and doesn't necessarily say anything about what the relationship would be like if it wasn't in this really artificial situation. So yeah, there's a lot in there around that imprisonment has quite specific impacts on relationships because it's such a restricted environment. As I've said, a lot of this is gendered, and the way that the institution can impact on family relationships for women is if you have the bulk of caring work being done outside by women. So women are traveling to visits, organising kids, balancing school, paying in money, waiting in for phone calls. If they're doing all that, if you're a woman in custody, you're much less likely to have someone who's doing that on the outside for you. So Lorna, I interviewed in custody, she's saying, some of the guys in here are quite happy, their wives are doing it all. The weans are looked after, but when the children are taken away from their mother, it's much more difficult. And she wasn't having any contact with her daughter because her ex-partner wasn't happy to facilitate it. And also because of the geography of Scotland and the fewer resources for women in custody, she was very, very geographically far away from her daughter. Yvonne, similarly, she actually geographically was very near to her family, but because no one in her family drove, she was really struggling to see her children. And her children were in kinship care, and the person caring for them was trying to balance their own family responsibilities and work, and then travel, and the prison's not being accessible. So Yvonne's saying, my weans are heartbroken, and so am I. If I could get to see them every week, then I'd be more than happy. So would any woman in that hall, but hardly any of them get to. 95 out of 100 women would want their kids brought up, given a wee sweetie and taken home again. That's all we want, but that's not happening for me, and it's not happening for a lot of the women that I know. So there are different barriers potentially for women and men in terms of maintaining family relationships that we also need to think about. Looking at families in the community, one of the key arguments that I make in the book is that we should be concerned about the impact of imprisonment, not just on individual families, but also at a higher, sort of more societal level. And one of the things that I argue is that we should be worried about not only the fact that imprisonment potentially creates all these gendered inequalities, and not only that imprisonment makes families already experiencing social marginalisation materially poorer and exacerbates poverty. Beyond all of those things, it also brings families into regular contact with the criminal justice system. And sometimes some of that contact can be quite difficult and challenging. And that is not to say, I want to be really clear here about what I'm not saying. I'm not saying that individuals who work with families, so visit staff, people who work on reception, I'm not saying that they don't make a huge effort to make families feel welcomed, because they do. But at the same time, families are interacting with a very large, complicated bureaucratic system that is very difficult for them to understand. They're often already experiencing a huge amount of adversity and difficulty. And then going beyond that, there's also quite a lot of research from the policing literature that shows that having one negative interaction out of every sort of 10, you know, that one negative one has a much more powerful impact on people than the 9 positive ones. And within that context, it then means that the everyday interactions that families have with criminal justice professionals, they are really, really important. And they're really important because they tell families about their relationship between themselves and the criminal justice system, and themselves and the state. So they inform families about how valued they are as citizens, and whether or not they feel that they could trust the criminal justice system, and whether or not the system is on their side. And quite a lot of the families that took part in this research felt that there was a bit of lack of give and take when they were dealing with criminal justice institutions, that they weren't always treated with respect, that rules were enforced inconsistently, that information wasn't clear. And the reason that this is really relevant to progression, I think, is kind of summed up in this quote that I've got. I'm interviewing one of the staff members working in the visitor centre, and I'm asking, you know, do you think you can improve relationships if you sort of explain the rules and educate people about how the system works? And they're saying, yes, because you're educating them about why prison staff do things. If I say that something's not allowed, I always try and explain why that rule is in place, because then they'll respect it. But if you keep banging on about rules and regulations and never explain why a rule is in place, then people lose their respect for you. And I think that really gets to this issue of legitimacy, right? If people feel something's unfair or unclear or inconsistent, then it doesn't feel as fair or legitimate or valid to them. So thinking about the context of progression and all the really interesting presentations that we've had today, how difficult it is for us as people who work in this system to keep track of how a progression journey is supposed to work, or what a risk assessment means, or what a holistic look at risk might look like, or even the acronyms of what is a GIC, what is an RMT, what is an ICM, why might they look different in Shotts compared to Barlinnie, compared to the Castle, right? Why are these not the same everywhere? This creates real problems for families. And I think a real implication for this is the provision of very, very clear information, but also information that is prison specific to where they are, and also that speaks to the questions that families have. You know, so it's sort of co-created in partnership with families. That's going to be much more productive than saying, you know, you can access the prison rules. So to round up, here are some of the implications, I think, of some of this. I think that there needs to be a much greater recognition of both the individual costs of imprisonment to families, but also the societal costs of if we don't support families. I think there are real implications here for justice, fairness, and citizenship, and how we value our citizens and how we show that they're valued and respected as citizens. I think there is a need for much greater visibility of families affected by imprisonment, both in research and practice. So I think there's lots more research still to be done. I think in terms of practice, things like looking at how is the family strategy implemented, what say do families have in that, Are they consulted? How is it monitored? How is that information communicated to them? What information is being made available to families? Thinking about the current circumstances where we're all working in a very difficult environment, how are families kept informed? Do they know when their partner or child is going to be able to access the things they need for their progression? How is that information being made clear? There needs to be supports for families, and lots of organisations in Scotland do a really, really good job here, but there always needs to be more. There always needs to be more funding for support and information for families. And then I think the last thing that I want to say is that there needs to be a recognition that working with families is incredibly skilled work, and that it's incredibly skilled work that the justice system asks of all professionals kind of across the board. Like, all these little interactions that families have with professionals, they all matter. So I don't really think it's enough to say we've got support services for families and they do family work. I think family work needs to be seen as everybody's job. It needs to be recognised as really, really skilled work. It needs to be, therefore, you need to give training and support and recognise good work and share good practice and really have a commitment across the system to meeting the needs and concerns of families. And I think I'm just about on time, so I'm going to stop. I'm very happy to speak more about any of those points that I've made.
Perfect. Thanks very much, Cara. I'm sure, like me, all the IPMs will have welcomed that presentation, and for a long time now, I'm not sure that we've really pinned down how we engage with families, if we do at all, as a prison monitoring cohort. And again, it's food for thought just about how we might do that, because there's a lot of information there that would assist our monitoring going forward. There's a couple of questions came in as you were talking, Karen. There's a few still coming in just now. So if you don't mind, I'll maybe aggregate some of those and file them to you in a remaining 10 or 12 minutes. One of the things which is maybe a little bit counterintuitive and maybe an unintended consequence was something that Jacqueline raised. She had asked about whether families might be overestimated as a protective factor then in risk assessments, given some of the structural barriers that you've highlighted in your presentation there, and what that would mean for risk assessment. I don't know if you have anything to say on that.
So I would start by saying I'm kind of a social scientist by training. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist or a social worker. I would say that the problems that the families that participate in my research have, they are representative of the communities that these families come from and the communities that are impacted by imprisonment. So really what we need to do is recognise that poverty is a huge overlap with criminal justice, right? And quite often, a lot of what these families need, they need money. So they can be a protective factor in that. And I interviewed a prison officer, and this has always stuck with me. You know, she said the families, they love them and they stand by them and they make them feel valued and they make them feel wanted, and that's important. But at the end of the day, if you're sending someone out of prison to a parent that's basically homeless, that's a very difficult situation to be in. So I think families, it all has to be looked at individually, but I would really not like to see what I've said being seen as a suggestion that families can't be a protective factor because there's something like wrong with them or they've got deficits. I think they have lots of strengths, and where a lot of the problems are, they really relate to the fact that we imprison poor people from poor communities, and that we've had, although the Scottish Government has tried to distance itself from Westminster, you know, we still see the impact of austerity. Sophie, the young mum who was on the slide saying everything's just been ripped away from me, she was talking about there's nowhere for me to take my children. The park across the road from us, it's covered in glass and syringes. There's no community groups or anything that I would take my children to. So I'm stuck in social housing in a high rise with 2 kids by myself. You know, and that is the issue, to me, that's the issue, rather than whether we should see families as a protective factor or a risk factor.
Thanks, Cara. A second question, I'm probably paraphrasing a little bit, but it's around the proposal to move some females to community custody units. I'm surmising from what you've said that you think that would be a good situation in the round, and that should be rolled out further if there was a political will. Or, I mean, I think the question was specifically about, does the same apply for male prisoners to be closer to their children? And I know your research is concluded.
Yeah, so yes. Well, firstly, yes and no, but I think community custody could be a hugely productive way forward, in that all the evidence says smaller institutions are safer institutions, being closer to community limits the impact on your family, it's more accessible. And I know there was some discussion around possibly having children to stay with you in custody suites or to do more innovative family contact, and all of that's really important. The risk is that we then have people from the communities like Sophie's with no facilities in their community in front of a sheriff who thinks, well, you'll get really good support in this community custody facility that you wouldn't get in the community. And that would be a massive worry for me. So yes and no, I think they're a good idea. In terms of gender, yes, absolutely. Men need support to keep in contact with their children. A lot of the dads talked really sort of movingly about how hard it was not being part of their children's lives and not being able to be there. But gender is still relevant, right? Because they talked about how do you be a dad? How do you teach your sons how to be a man? Like, how do we give people the opportunity to do that in a prison environment, which is really infantilizing for adults? You know, you don't get a lot of control and autonomy and choice and the ability to show your children responsible decision making. So I think that's really important too.
Thanks, Cara. I'm going to troll through some of the other comments just now. Do any of the other panellists want to come in? Do they have any questions or comments on Cara's presentation while I check out some of the questions that are coming in?
Just to say, Cara, it just resonates so much with the Family Outside conference that I attended and their views and opinions. Having worked in prisons for years, I'm all too conscious that women really suffer disproportionately in prison because they, in their minds, retain the primary carer role. And seeing children separated from their mother at the end of a visit is heartrending. And I think the number of women we incarcerate and the reasons for their incarceration and, you know, the detriment that it causes to the families is really concerning. So it's lovely to hear that backed up by your user voice.
I've just been reminded of something in the comments, and it's Mark from Berlin that's raised it, and we're talking about progression, and I don't think we've mentioned through care today. And it is notable that at last year's conference we spoke about the removal of through care officers. So thanks to Margaret, I've just seen Margaret come on the screen. Thanks to Mark for raising that, because it is an issue. We were spoken to last year and told that there would be an intention to bring through care officers back, dedicated through care officers, and we don't have them. So there's clearly an issue around transitions from custody into the community with a diminishing resource. Any other thoughts from the panel before we wrap up?
Just to say, I think it's been fascinating. Really, thanks very much, Cara, for that. That was really, really thought-provoking. And it certainly emphasised for me just again the complexity of those relationships, but also the fact that they are very fragile both, and that point about the extent to which you can rely on them as the supportive factor when they're carrying so much difficulties of their own is really powerful. So thank you very much. That was just terrific.
No worries. And the other thing I would say is if you don't have the time, energy or inclination to read the whole book about this, I have written that up. Some of the key findings is a briefing paper that's been published by Families Outside. So that might be a useful resource as well for people.
Yeah, we'll definitely try and circulate that around all our IPMs, Cara, thanks for that. Okay, just a very brief summing up then, and I'll maybe hand over just quickly to the Chief Inspector at the end, but I think for all IPMs, we're really grateful to you tuning in today to join in the webinar. It's not been the conference that we would want to have, and we've not maybe the level of interaction that we would normally have, but I hope that you found something in there today that's been really useful. I certainly have, and I've got lots of takeaways that I now need to go away and follow up on. I think the overview from Wendy this morning about how important and critical it was to retain that monitoring function during the pandemic is really worth noting again, because it has been it's been really impressive that we've been able to maintain contact with prisons, prison officers and prisoners throughout this whole thing, and now we're going back into the prisons, which is such a credit to all of you as independent prison monitors. The presentation from Spark, which I hope has sparked a little bit of a collaboration, if you'll pardon the pun, between HMIPS and yourselves, was thought-provoking in so many ways, and especially with regards to credibility of available opportunities to prove yourself. I noted Scott's comments in the break about IPMs continuing to ask, and he's suggesting that we do continue to ask about availability of programmes until that risk assessment paradigm shows that it has shifted a little bit more to the holistic end of the spectrum. So that's a bit of a takeaway for me, I think, as well. I'm really grateful to Eddie for coming on. I know he's went elsewhere, but for other meetings, but he came on and he's addressed the COVID backlog from an SPS point of view, and what he's hearing all our reflections about prisoner frustration. And you can see, I think, genuinely from speaking to him this week, that he's got a real willingness to try and get through that and provide solutions. So I also think he's given us something to monitor against, which is helpful, because often with progression you don't really know what you're monitoring against. But I think he's provided a bit of a framework in terms of saying what the SPS are doing, and there's maybe a bit of follow-up for us to do there as well. His presentation might take a little bit of unpicking, but we can try and circulate that so as that we have a framework to monitor against. And then lastly, Cara, thanks very much for that presentation on families, which was really interesting. And straight away I'm thinking about, should we have a greater presence in visit rooms? Should we have a desk in the visit rooms? And these are all things for the future, but we're missing out on a lot of good information about how we can potentially go and ask questions of the senior managers within each establishment if we know a little bit more about how prisoners and prisoners' families are dealing with the cost of sentencing. So I've really enjoyed all of the presentations today. I'm really pleased that so many prison monitors, members of our advisory group and people from SPS have tuned into the webinar today as well. So we'll keep the collaboration going, Cara and Scott, and also my thanks to Eddie. I'll hand over to Wendy now, just in case you've got any concluding remarks before we finish up, Wendy.
Just to say, I've absolutely loved today. I mean, I also have learned quite a lot, so I really appreciate it. Cara, you were excellent, really enjoyable. But a couple of things. One is there will be a Zoom session for IPMs with a newsletter coming out in December. But part of that Zoom session is I really want to pick your brains on what it's been like to develop practical solutions to going into prisons and coping with the COVID crisis, as well as those people who don't want to go in, what it's been like getting the phone calls organised, the phone calls with prisoners, and to pick your brains about how we can improve that and make it better. So the Zoom session that we'll have in December will be a Christmassy one. So it will allow everybody to ask questions and talk amongst yourselves and do all those things that are kind of more sociable. So I shall be wearing my Christmas jumper, and I look forward to seeing all of you in your Christmas jumpers. But importantly, thank you so much, Cara. I honestly worried that this conference would not be as good as the ones of when we managed to pull these together in a hotel. And we certainly missed out from the informal networking and the possibility of gaining feedback from IPMs. But I felt it was informative. It was at times emotional, and I really enjoyed it. So Chris, thank you very much for a good conference, and I look forward to seeing you all in December.
Thanks, Wendy. Okay, so once again, just on behalf of everyone, thanks to the speakers, thanks to all of you as IPMs. Your coordinators and the rest of HMIPS will be in touch, no doubt, next week as we continue just rolling on, making our phone calls into the prisons, conducting our visits during this strange time. So I hope everyone has a good weekend, and we'll conclude the conference there. Thanks very much.